Before we begin, I was just gonna, have everyone introduce themselves, talk a little bit about your respective neurosurgical programs, what sets your program apart from everyone else, what you love about your residents and or the city or town you guys live in. Dr. Murad, you want to go first?
Sure, I will go first. So I'm Greg Murad. I'm from University of Florida. It's UF in Gainesville, Florida. So our residency we take 3 residents per year, so we take 21 total. Our residency is, our stated goal for our graduates is to be excellent neurosurgeons, to be compassionate people, and also to be excellent researchers. So, if you come here, we expect you to participate in research, and we'd really like it if you became an academic neurosurgeon when you finished our program. We realize that's not the reality for everybody, but that's kind of our stated goal. We have a very busy, tertiary care medical center. Even though Gainesville is sort of a small college town, we get patients from all over Florida because of we have a lot of high acuity patients that get transferred from Florida, South Georgia, Alabama. I think our residents do a lot of surgery. They are very busy when they are in the hospital. We do have dedicated research here as your PGY4 plus or minus your PGY5, depending on what you want to do with your career. We have an R25 grant to help support resident research, which you can apply for. Currently, one of our residents is R25 funded. And I think we have a very diverse residency program. It's about 40% females, or what we call underrepresented minorities in neurosurgery. And so I think we have a great group, and we work really hard, and we have fun. And I think that we're lucky in that we get great applicants who come to our program, virtually the last few years, hopefully in person this year, but that we still remain to be seen as to how we'll interact with our applicants in the fall. So that was a brief overview.
Thank you. Dr. Finger, if you want to talk about a little bit, introduce yourself and talk about your program, your residents, and the thing you love most about your town.
Sure. Hi, I'm Libby Infinger, and I'm in Charleston, South Carolina at MUSC, or Medical University of South Carolina. I do pediatric neurosurgery and just am transitioning into taking over the program director role. We have a great program. We have 2-year residents. In the past, our program has been more kind of folks staying regional, going into private practice, but over the last 10 years or so, we're having a kind of more robust research component to our program, and a lot more people are going into academics. I think the last one that went to private practice was about 8 years ago. So we're really we just had our resident research day this week, and it's amazing all the work that our residents are doing. We have a big research curriculum that one of our associate program directors has brought to our program, and a lot of folks are getting grants and really being proliferative in the research and publication component. We have a great community. Sounds cliche, but we really are a big family with all our residents. Everyone gets along really well and spends a lot of time outside of the hospital when possible together, both faculty and residents independently. Charleston's a wonderful city. If anyone's been there, it's a lot to do on the water. Could do their activities pretty much year round, and it's a great place to be if you're single, great place to be if you have a family. A lot of good stuff to do in town. So I did residency training there and then went away for fellowship and came back as faculty. So I really enjoy it.
Thank you. Dr. Baskin, if you want to talk about.
Sure. My name is David Baskin, and I'm got several different roles. I'm the residency program director at Houston Methodist since 2005. I'm the vice chair of the department, and I'm the director of our brain tumor center, where we have raised $24 million in fundings and have 7 PhDs, a very large laboratory doing a variety of what we like to think are pretty novel things. Houston Methodist is an incredible place. We have 9 neurosurgical ORs running 5 days a week. We have a 36-bed dedicated neurosurgery ICU, and we're constructing 2 more ORs. We do about 6,000 cases a year. Our residents operate like crazy. We have many cases that are uncovered by residents, including craniotomies, because we have such a high volume. We have only 2 residents a year because I've always wanted to be sure that the residents, got to do all the other good cases. We do have a spine fellowship. We can also have an infolded fellowship opportunity for neurocritical care, and we're certified in neurocritical care. Our residents, if they want to do an endovascular fellowship, get to do the large number of angiograms needed. I think it's 150 a year during the rotation in radiology. And we are going to also have fellowships in brain tumor and skull base and endovascular fairly shortly. Houston's the 4th largest city in the US. It's kind of an interesting place in that you can do just about anything. I mean, it's very urban and it's very rural. If you want to go horseback riding, you can drive 15 minutes from Houston, from the medical center, and go to a place and ride horses. A lot of the residents live close because there's nice kind of semi-rural areas very close to the medical center. In many places you have to live an hour away to have that, but not in Houston. We have some special things in our program, which is we have a 6-month opportunity where our residents can go to London at St. George's Infirmary and serve as kind of a senior registrar, almost a junior attending. All the residents love it. It's an opportunity to see a completely different healthcare system and to serve kind of in a completely different role. Healthcare in the UK is quite different than Houston, and it's a great opportunity, not to mention that living in London for 6 months is a terrific experience. We have a pediatric rotation in Austin, and our residents love that. They're the only resident there. They work at Dell Children's, and they also do a little bit of level 1 trauma center in Austin. And Elon Musk is now in Austin, and one of our residents is actually doing brain-computer interface, working with him. He won't tell me what he's doing because I guess he'll have to kill me if he does, but they're actually doing brain-computer interfaces in animals. And Elon showed up last week and said, why the hell can't we get this in a human? You guys need to get moving. So it's an exciting program, lots of opportunities. We have major research programs in brain tumors. Like I said, we have $24 million in funding for that program. We do work also in robotics. We have 7 different robots available in our OR. We have 2 surgical theater virtual reality systems. And then we also have work in neuroregeneration. We have a guy that grows little brains out of cells. I don't know if you saw on Time magazine, it looks like little tiny brains. I don't know what the hell these brains do, but he grows them. And we have a big program in spinal regeneration. So we're a 7-year program. There's a 1-year required research component. We love to train academic neurosurgeons, but I think we value the people who also want to contribute in private practice. So it's an exciting place. We know all our residents. They're like family. They're all mainly in Houston Methodist, unless they're in Austin with Elon Musk or with the pediatric, or in London. We have great relationship with the London people. We talk with the people, residents in London, about every other week. So it's a great place, and we're also blessed with a lot of applicants. We had over 300 applicants for 2 positions.
Thank you. Dr. Leonardo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jody Leonardo, and I'm the program director at Allegheny Health Network in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for the invitation to come and tell you a little bit about our program. So our program, we're at 2 per year, obviously 7-year program. We just kind of transitioned our chief year into the PGY 6 year. So that leaves our PGY 7 year in alignment, with the ABNS to do a CAST Imported Fellowship. So we have 3 approved CAST Imported Fellowships: neuro-oncology, a complex spine, as well as functional, and hoping to get endovascular this coming year. The heart and soul of our program is actually, I think, the faculty and the drive to help the residents get to their goals. It's pretty simple. We are a very high volume operative center, and I think that's where Allegheny General has always stood out, given the high volume. But from a program director perspective, our main goal is to help the students get to where they want. So whether it's staying in academics, whether it's going out there into the community, whether it is developing other interests along the way, our curriculum is set up to essentially get you to where you want to go. That being said, if you look back at our previous residents, we probably have about I think it's a 60% rate of residents going into academics, but that's based on what they want and what they desire. From our research, we don't have mandatory research time, but we give research opportunities through a steady curriculum that we introduce the residents to as a PGY 1. So some of them, my PGY 6 now is taking a year off of research because that's what he wanted to do. Our other residents are involved in a lot of clinical studies that we do with Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Hopkins, and other centers around the country. I think looking at what our program and how our program differs is we have a laboratory center within our hospital. It's called the Center for the Surgical Arts, that was inspired by Dr. Aziz as well as Dr. Janetta. And it essentially has 21 stations for residents to do neurodissection. So from that bioskills, we actually have a bioskill curriculum where 2 times a month, 1 cranial, 1 spine, we bring the residents down to the labs and with cadavers and essentially have the faculty, the seniors teach the juniors. And it's really interesting because no matter what year the residents are, they pick something up because we go through the curriculum on a yearly basis. So that's an awesome opportunity for the residents. And it's funny because when the medical students that are from, Drexel that rotate our program, they always say, oh my gosh, we took this for granted, that everyone has this. And it's something that is so unique for our program. And out of that lab, the other thing that we're able to do is run national courses. So we have about 7 national courses that we hold per year, which for a medical student and incoming resident means that the residents have access to faculty, national and international faculty coming in all the time to give these courses. So, the networking that you can make as a resident with, the skull-based neurosurgical meeting we have, the endoscopic neurosurgical meeting, the spine is something that's really interesting to see the relationships grow throughout the years. So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today is a very dreary, rainy day, but is a beautiful place to live. Our hospital is actually located on the north side of the north side of the city. So where the 3 rivers meet, we're within walking distance of the riverbank. And it's been Pittsburgh, obviously, as all cities have been hit a little bit hard by the COVID, but it is a city that's easy to work and live in, great restaurants, and the residents enjoy being here, as do I and the faculty. So it's a great program.
Thank you, Dr. Leonardo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nair and Dr. Brandon-Meyer, I know you guys just joined. The prompt was if you guys could talk a little bit about your respective neurosurgical programs, what sets your programs apart from others, what do you love most about your residents or the town you live in?
Sure, I'm happy to speak. Hi, I'm Nate Nair. I'm the program director at Medstar Georgetown University. It's a 2-year program, 7-year program. As of last year, we now are affiliated in partnership with the NIH. So it's 2 a year at Georgetown, 1 a year at the NIH. with similar pathways for both groups of residents. Large case volume, I think very much like what Dr. Leonardo said, our goal is to inspire residents to be whatever best version of themselves that they want to become sort of 10 years down the line. Our goal is to bend the arc of their career in such a way that they get there. As part of the program, 2 years in the middle of your residency, you are free to do research. Now, research can be done at the NIH. We have several residents who continue to do that. The NIH residents obviously do that. You can also do research at a biomechanics lab. We've had residents who are now in preparation to do their MBAs in that 2-year period. What we don't want you to do in those 2 years is just more cases. We are confident you'll get case numbers in the other years. We want you to do some experience in that 2-year period that really will shape the way your career turns out in the 5 to 10 years after you graduate. DC is a wonderful city. It's an expanding city. And I would say our residents and our faculty are the primary drivers of what make it a great program. Our residents are dedicated to the neurosciences and the sciences behind neurosurgery, which is what makes them so passionate and hardworking. And so that's what we seek, hardworking, dedicated individuals is our bread and butter. And those are the applicants we're looking for. So thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Brandmeier, thank you for joining us. I know you were on call. If you don't mind telling us a little about the program at WVU.
Yeah, sure. Apologize everybody that I was late. I'm on call for the ICU and neurosurgery. So busy morning, but I made it almost on time. Anyways, at WVU, we're a busy kind of rural academic program. We are 1 a year, although our clinical volume is much closer to like a 2-a-year program, but it's easier to expand faculty than it is to expand residency programs. And so although we're working on expanding the residency program 2 a year right now, we're 1 a year, probably will be for the next couple of years. I guess what makes our program unique is a lot of the things that make other small programs unique in that, like, you get a lot of time in the operating room, you get a lot of one-on-one training with your faculty, you do all your training at one hospital, so you're not covering multiple places, you're not spending 6 months at one hospital and then a year here to do peds and whatever. You do all your training in the same faculty, same hospital. We have 2 postgraduate fellowships, post-residency fellowships that we offer. One is in critical care and one is in functional neurosurgery. So we have fellows. The other thing that makes it unique is that we're busy and we're 1 a year program. And so we really focus on the educational experience of the residents because there's just not even close to enough of them to help significantly with the day-to-day work. So we can't be like, well, we use the residents to do the work. There's just that would take away too much from their training. And so the residents are really focusing on the training and the education and kind of a lot of the day-to-day work, discharge summaries, routine consults, routine rounding on stable patients on the floor, clinic help, clinic follow-up. All of that is largely done by APPs, and the residents really are focused on the operating room and educational training. And now we do 1 year off that most residents use for enfolded fellowships of 1 degree or another, although also bench research is supported, as well as, like, if you wanted to get an MBA or something, that's supported. Or we just had a resident who's very focused on wanting to do skull base, and so he spent his year doing kind of like a detailed skull base cadaver dissection experience to, like, learn all about that and get more familiar with that anatomy as he prepares for a skull base fellowship here in a few years. So yeah, so and we're like, Morgantown's like I would say like a suburb of Pittsburgh more than it is like a small town in West Virginia. So we're like an hour and a half south of Pittsburgh, across state line obviously, but much more of that kind of feel, environment, location than what you think of as like southern Appalachian coalfield kind of location. It's not really Morgantown as such. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brandon Meyer, and thank you to everyone for giving up your Saturday to join us, especially the faculty members. Really do appreciate you. This is important to get the word out, especially for students that are applying this year, as well as students that are interested in neurosurgery. So we appreciate you guys are able to participate in our East virtual training camp for this year. So we're going to open the floor now to the audience for questions. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and the program directors will try their best to address this as best as they can. While we wait for questions to come in, I will start off by asking some questions myself. And I will start off by asking questions about the sub-I. So my first question is for the program directors. What advice do you have for neurosurgical applicants preparing for sub-internships?
I can go first. I'll just say that quickly, I consider that it's sort of like a job interview for a month. I think that you need to approach these things very professionally in terms of, you need to come, and the idea is that you're going to come and you'll work really hard to sort of audition. It's also an opportunity for you to look at the program and see what how you would fit in at the program. I mean, I think you should aim for sub-Is at places that you really would like to go to, because I think your chances of matching at a program are higher if you do a sub-I there than if you're just coming through regular interviewing, because you get to make a positive impression. It's not an opportunity to necessarily like go out and party in town and things like that. And shockingly, I've seen people do that over the years, and it just really surprised me that you have to be very professional and hard-nosed, and try to work as part of the team. And depending on the atmosphere at the place, I think that do you really want to impress the residents or the faculty? You want to be able to work as part of the team. You have to treat everybody that you are working with respect. That goes down to the people that clean up the OR and the scrub techs and the nurses, and you're not just trying to impress the faculty, you're trying to just be a good member of the team. So I think that ideally you do your sub-I at your home institution first, and they can teach you some a little bit about neurosurgery and things. And then you can go to the away sub-Is and show them your skills, and be prepared and be ready to really bust your hump for the month to show that you're engaged.
Yeah, I think those are all good pieces of advice. I think, you have to look at what is the goal of doing a sub-internship. It's several things. One is, if you've done your research, you really would like to learn more about these specific programs. And I think you'll find that if you do go to 2 or 3 sub-Is, you're going to learn things that you wouldn't be able to otherwise find out. So you're trying to do a little bit of a discovery to figure out, hey, I like these programs. I like kind of what they are on paper. Now, what are they really like? So that's the first goal. The second goal, there is no question that even though we try not to just take people who do sub-Is, that as program directors, we're a little bit of disadvantage. We do interviews. We may interview 8 or 16 people in a day. Each person has 20 minutes. They rotate around, and we try to, obsess about what each of us learned about that person. But that pales in comparison to somebody spending a month with you. So it is an opportunity to put your best foot forward. And absolutely what Dr. Murad said is right. We'll have sub-Is, people come for sub-Is, and they're really nice and seem terrific, and then they're nasty to the secretaries. Well, that's not very smart. Obviously that's going to get out. We're going to hear about that, and we're looking for things that make us really want to take somebody. But because we had over 300 applicants for 2 spots, if we hear something negative, that's sort of the kiss of death. We say, oh, we don't need that person, because that person's going to be with us for 7 years. It's, sometimes marriages don't last as long as neurosurgical residencies. So it is really important that if you do go up to a place, you think about putting your best foot forward at all times. It's not the time to party. I agree with that. And you know, we've learned an awful lot about people who do sub-Is, both good and bad. So, you know, keep that in mind. I think it's good to try to take a spectrum of maybe one of the harder programs you think it is for you to get into, and to also go to a couple of places where it's a little bit easier. Because again, you know, just like when you apply to colleges and medical school, you want to quote a safety. I don't know if there's any safeties in neurosurgery, but if you do a rotation at a place that might be a little easier to get in, they really like you, that also solidifies your chance to match. So there's a lot of different purposes, and I think you have to try to keep them all in mind and do your research before you just send out requests for sub-Is, because you can only do so many.
Any other thoughts?
I think those are all great points. You know, as students, when you go on your sub-I, it can be very overwhelming, especially at the beginning, but it is so important to remember that this is your opportunity to shine. And, you know, if you do 3 sub-Is, four sub-Is back in the day, but 3 sub-Is, you're going to be exhausted, but try to keep the energy up, try to be engaged, try to really get to know all of the faculty, because you know, depending upon how the different programs do their final ranking, a lot of programs, many people have a voice. So spend time with as many people as you can, and treat every day as a job interview. And just to echo, you know, what the previous program directors say, you know, you wanna, when we select a medical student to be a resident at our facilities, we want someone who is going to be our face for our patients, you know, in our hospital. And so just think of that, you know, when you're going about your daily business. The other thing I think that's important to mention is it does get stressful and overwhelming for sub-Is, just because most places you're one of many sub-Is. And so you feel that you're, you know, in this competitive arena, and you are. But focus on yourself, focus on doing the best that you can, stay out of the drama, just work hard, and people will pay attention to that.
I'd also add, and this might address some of the questions in the chat. If you know you don't have a million publications, or you don't have the best scores in the world, the sub-I is your time to shine and show us your true character, your true knowledge, your hustle and hard work for the month that a board score doesn't show, or, you know, comes through with more, you know, shows your true value instead of being on 20 publications where you only did the lit review search. You know, the sub-I is your time to shine, and to figure out if you want to be at the place for the next 7 years. It's a audition both ways, kind of, but they're great for those folks that might have not the most stellar CV to really sell yourself for that month to the programs.
Yeah, I would agree with that, what everyone else has said. I think your sub-I is an opportunity to demonstrate your ability to be a good member of a team, to take care of patients as best you can, to be honest and hardworking. And I think the idea of competition does come in if you're with multiple sub-Is, but I think one thing you slowly need to lose as you go from student to independent provider is the idea that this isn't a competition for your own benefit. You're no longer the center of your own educational world. A patient or patients are the center of your world. And it's really important to remember the idea that in a rising sea, all boats rise in a rising sea, right? Like stepping on your co-residents, embarrassing your co-residents, trying to make it into a situation where you look good because they look bad doesn't help anyone. You know, I think a lot of times groups of residents will remember an entire month's worth of sub-Is and have positive or negative views based on the gestalt. And so you're better off if the whole cohort does well than if you shine, because you shining alone, you know, that the benefit there may actually be that you stepped on other people to get there, and people will notice that.
I 100% agree. And if you are kind of dishonest or not helping others shine around you, the residents pick up on it, the faculty picks up on it. And at our program, the residents have an equal vote to a faculty member on the ranking list. So if they feel that you were, you know, shady or dishonest or not, not helping others around you, they'll report back and share it with everybody.
I think the other thing, because I remember some very malignant sub-Is, and but like neurosurgery is a very small world. And so if you're a malignant sub-I with a bad reputation, and you do match, nobody is going to forget that. And I remember who all those guys are if they made it in and matched, and most of them didn't if they were terrible, and everybody else knows who they are. And it is not a good way to start a career, unless your goal is to, be isolated in a hospital and not well respected by your colleagues. And that's, I don't think, anybody's goal. So there's absolutely no advantage to gunning your co-sub-Is. That is a disastrous move during a sub-I.
Thank you, everyone. I was going to move on to the application process, and I have a lot of questions for you guys. With a lot of things changing with step one, going from a numerical score to pass-fail and preference signaling. I just wanted to get your opinions about sort of those changes and how that influences the application process.
I mean, I'll go first because I feel like, not from the standpoint of my residencies in the match, but I feel more for my medical students, WVU, and also coming from a smaller medical school myself. I went to Albany Med. I think getting rid of the numerical score in step one hurts students at small, less prestigious schools, and you have to work 1,000 times harder to separate yourself because you don't have the name on the degree and maybe even the research opportunities that other students have. And so I think if you're from a top tier, very prestigious medical school with a very busy neurosurgery program research wise, it helps you because it's one less thing that can trip you up. And if you're from one of these schools where you kind of have to really show you're a cut above to get in, it's one less thing where you can excel at. And so I'm pretty down on it and frustrated. And I think realistically, I've been not a million years, but I've been around long enough that I've seen a bunch of good ideas for medical education come and go. Like interns can't take a 24-hour call, and then they can. And, this is a work hours restriction, and then this is not. And I think that this is a good idea that's going to be here for a few years. It's not going to work out, and it's going to be changed to something that does work. Or we're just going to invent a different test to normalize our applicants. But anyways, yeah, I think it's kind of uniformly negative from the standpoint of the medical students.
I would take a slightly different tack with that. We have not been using board scores in our assessment of applicants for several years now. We've done more holistic review processes as put out by some of the national societies, and it's difficult, it's time consuming, but we have found that it's been beneficial. We actually don't release board scores to our interviewers until after they've done they've given us objective scoring in various domains. And one thing we actually found in this last year is that board score had no correlation whatsoever to interviewer ranking of the applicant. And that data actually is supported by data that's been looked at board scores in relationship to passing neurosurgery boards down the line, and there's no real relationship there. So we haven't been using them, and I think this is an opportunity for students who may not have done well on the boards to excel in other ways, to show your leadership, to show your passion for the field. Do that through publications, through involvement, through your student organizations. I think there are different ways to show your passion for neurosurgery, which I think is what we all want. We want someone who's truly passionate about the field, who's going to stick with 7 years. Boards were one way, a surrogate marker, not necessarily a great surrogate marker for passion, but I think it's now an opportunity to look at those other ways.
Sorry, Dr. Neer, I'm just interested. Do you guys have a floor, like a low score below which you don't interview, or you'll interview somebody with, in the past, like a 189, 200, they get an interview the same as somebody with a 265?
So our reviewers are blinded to the scores. I don't give them the scores, and then we have resident reviewers, we have faculty reviewers, and then what we do is we choose the ones that have both faculty and resident, that both the reviewers of the applications have agreed that they like, then those are the ones we choose. We found that we get a large spread of board scores in there. We'll still interview candidates. I mean, our own students at Georgetown don't necessarily do not necessarily meet the average board score that you see in neurosurgery, and they still go into the match, and they do well in the match. So we don't necessarily use it. Now, post this year, when we did use it, where it comes up is when we start looking at it as a comparator to interview scores. And that actually gave us great confidence that what we're doing is okay, and that our process is going to be okay moving forward, because there was no correlation. Like, it was like no correlation. Some of the candidates who were worst ranked were the ones with the highest board scores. And so it gives me great comfort that using sort of that holistic review can be effective. We need to improve it, but that I'm not too despondent about the score going away.
No, that was just from my learning about how to learn how to do it without the board scores going forward. Thanks.
Yeah, we're all going to have to do it, obviously. My position is somewhere in between. I mean, there's no question that you can have somebody as an applicant with a very high board score who's, you know, for any number of reasons that we all can imagine, is not really a very good applicant. But at the same time, I think your question about, do you have a floor? I mean, if somebody has really bad board scores, can be a red flag in their ability to process large amounts of information. I mean, neurosurgery is, you know, learning an incredible large number of things that you have to continue to remember forever. So, I mean, we don't just use the board scores, but we're not happy that they're going away, because it's just one other thing to look at. And it, you know, it probably is more of a concern when they're really low than when they're really high. When they're really high, it's still complex, but when they're really low, most of those people that we have taken, and when we first started our program, we took a few of them, had problems. I mean, they had problems with neurosurgery boards. They had problems with, you know, multitasking and complex information. I think there is some relationship, but it really doesn't matter because they're going away. So we all have to get as smart as Dr. Nair to figure out how to do this without them.
To be fair, it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has everything to do with just finding faculty and staff who are willing to review applications, right? I mean, in the old system, it's really easy for a single person to review 300 applications if you just put them in order. And I've done it, right? Put them in order of board scores and send out application requests on the basis of that. It's not even a one-person job. It's a 1-hour job. It's why application requests could go out right after, you know, applications were due or opened up. It does require a lot, and I think the complexity of it comes from, these are faculty members who are not being paid to do it. These are residents who have other jobs. How do you motivate people to do that in that work environment, in our current work environment? So don't get me wrong, there's a lot wrong with holistic review and the way we do it, but it's just work hours. It just requires more processing of the application, which is hard to get people to do.
I think that it's probably going to end up putting more pressure on step 2 as some sort of differentiator. I mean, I can say that our program essentially set a floor of the board score, which is like the 30th percentile to review your application. And then the board score basically disappears. But that was the thing, because we get, you know, something like 380 applications, and for me to wean that down to like 275 applications that's the way our program does it. You know, it is frustrating from the PD perspective, because there's more schools that are going to pass fail for grades. even in the past couple of years when there was COVID, there's all these COVID grades where they said that they normally have a grade, but then they went to pass fail. I actually started doing a project looking at the written comments, because you read the written comments and it's like, this is the best student I've ever had in surgery and they're the greatest. And then their score is pass. And then, you know, versus honors or something. So it's like the written comments, even the dean's letters, like some of them will kind of give some sense as to how the student is ranked in their class. Many of them don't. So it's just, we're trying to differentiate people to some degree. And when you have this huge volume of people that are applying, things that help to differentiate a little bit, I think are helpful. So I have a feeling that we're probably going to have to do something with step 2. We're going to have to see how many applications come in to try to figure out like just how to limit the total, because we do a holistic review, but I can't do a holistic review, or I guess we're not motivated enough to do a holistic review on every single application that comes in the door.
Any other thoughts on the changes for step 1? All right. Thank you, guys. That was a very good discussion. I actually learned a lot myself. I was gonna move forward and then discuss preference signaling for the ERAS application, which is the new thing that is associated with the supplemental ERAS, where you get to tell, I believe it's 8 neurosurgical programs that you're interested in them. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and how that would influence the application process as well.
Well, I think it's helpful. I mean, this is just from a program director perspective, and I've done it forever. You know, you obviously, in the algorithm in the match, it favors the applicants. I've been through this with the statistician at the match, and it should favor the applicants. So if you're a program director, you know, you don't want to rank 15 people who don't want you because you end up going way down on your list. And so, you know, every year when we have this discussion, one of the factors that goes into where we rank somebody is whether they really want to come or not. And, you know, so for example, if people have parents that live in Houston, well, you know, that might be a motivating factor for them to want to be there. Or if they have a spouse that really is doing couples match, and you know that that program is going to take them because you're allowed to ask about that then. So we really do want to know if people want to come. And you know, this last year was like a nightmare because everyone applied to about 90 programs and everybody interviewed, you know, wearing a tie and their underwear because it was all Zoom. And so it was even more bewildering than usual who actually wants to come to your program, you know, because before, at least, you know, financially, 15, 20 interviews was about all that anyone could afford. So I think this is going to be helpful. It's still going to be hard for us because, okay, so you're ranked 8 or 9 programs. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're not at the bottom of your list, but I think everybody here has a really good program. The real question is, are we at the top of your list? So I think it's going to help, but I don't think it's going to revolutionize anything. I mean, the rules of the game are if somebody really wants to come to your program, we can listen to what you have to say. And you can tell us we're going to rank you highly. You can say, I want to rank you #1. We can't ask you, but we can listen. So that's a subtle part of the application process, but we all do want to rank people that actually are going to rank us. And it's asymmetrically unbalanced, which is okay. That's the way it is. But it's something for an applicant to keep in mind. If you really like a program, you want to rank them #1. There's no harm in telling them that because that's something that's important to us.
Dr. Baskin, just to add to that, what if you do send out 8 preference signaling and you apply to other programs and you did not send those to those other programs? How is that viewed?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. This is a new thing, right? So it's I mean, I'm not even aware of this rule. Is it that we're all going to see that every program you apply to is going to see that you made these 8 preferences, or I'm not sure exactly how that's working yet. Do you know?
I believe it's program specific. I'm not sure.
Right. Well, if I think what's going to happen, and I don't know that yet, but I think what's going to happen is everyone's going to say, all the program directors going to say, well, these applicants have a chance to list their 8 programs. So if we're not listed, we're probably not one of those 8 programs, right? So then we're probably, however we put that in our algorithm, we're going to say, well, you know, maybe we don't want to rank this person number 1 because we're probably number 9 on their list. I mean, I'm sure that's inevitable. We all do that. I don't know if everyone else is going to admit to this, but we all do that because we don't want to rank a bunch of people that have no interest in us. So I'm not sure how favorable this is actually going to be.
I think what it's going to do is give, in the current environment of virtual interviewing, where it's very easy to interview at a lot of programs. Previously, the threshold of burden was, you know, if you had to pay, and people were taking out student loans to go on interviews. So if a place wasn't on your list, you weren't going to pay for the hotel and the flight. That was a signal that you were sending. There was value attached to that signal. In virtual interviews, you can interview it. You know, we've had people interview at all programs, you know, send applications to every program. So the signaling effect here means that we are all interviewing a lot of people, or getting a lot more applications than we normally would to go through. You know, we have to process them. This is going to make the signal of the student more valuable, which is going to make it easier for program directors to review the applications of the people they are truly interested in. And so by adding that value to the signal that students have, you sort of replicate what used to be dollar and cents spent by the student on interviewing with you. So I think from some perspective, it's going to help make the workload on reviewing applications easier.
I think that's a good point. It's a good point.
I'm kind of the opinion that that their preference signaling by coming to your place to interview, or taking the time to interview. We don't interview, you know, we interview about 50 people. We have 12 per day, and it depends on how many sub-Is we have. If we try to interview sub-Is when they're here. So maybe we'll end up with, like, you know, 6 or 7 sub-Is. Recently there haven't been many, but hopefully this year there'll be more. But so those 50 people, I don't really think that makes a big difference personally for our program, like where they rank to us. You know, we're trying to pick the people that we want, and if they really want us, they'll rank us high on their list. So as Dr. Baskin said, you guys have the preference over the programs, and so, you know, I think that if you're interested, then you'll rank us high. Like, I don't care where you fall on my rank list. If you're number 50 on my rank list and you come here, it means I still wanted you to come here because I put you on my rank list.
Dr. Murrah, just to follow up with your question, Gabriel Johnson in the Q&A is asking, with the preference signaling happening before things like interviews, what if the perspective changes after interviews? Do you still think the PDs will rely on the first talk preference signaling?
Again, I mean, I think that if you want to rank our program number 1, I encourage our medical students, if they want to rank a program number 1, they should tell that program. So the programs know. But other than that, I don't really, you know, we talk about this sometimes, and our chairman always says it doesn't matter, just rank the people where we want them in our list, you know, and if they want to come here, they'll come here. You know, we say, oh, this person's from Florida, or their, you know, dad worked, you know, at this place, and they, I mean, to my understanding, the algorithm, it preferences the medical students, and so if they want to come to our program, they will. And so, you know, trying to ascertain who wants to come where and all that kind of stuff, I don't know that really matters that much.
Yeah, I have to say what Dr. Murrah is saying is, I mean, there's the match system is actually been demonstrated to be one of, like, it's the first best way of matching people that, like, when it came out, other fields have started using this system because it's one of the fairest ways of doing it. And it basically says you don't have to strategize. You shouldn't strategize. Your strategy should be, I will rank you in the order that I like you, and programs will rank me in the order that they like me, and I will end up at the best place for me, and programs will get the best place for them. Like there's never, if the system works properly, we are all going to end up with the place that likes us the most, that we can get into without having to worry that, oh, maybe we missed out on some other place. So the strategy should just be rank as you like a program.
Yeah, that would be that. We do not, at least in the past, have never taken preference signaling into account with our rank. We play the game honestly and encourage everybody to play the game honestly. That's the only way to lose is to get too clever and like try and strategize. If you just rank things in the way that you'd actually like to go, that's the best strategy for maximizing your outcome. Absolutely. And the same for programs. So we don't really take it into account.
Thank you, guys. So the next question is from Ali Hidab Bangash. So his question is, what is the most important factor that you look at in the application process? We have the letters of rec and extracurricular activities, etc. So what do you guys, looking at that, what is the most important thing you guys look at first? And how does that play a role in your decision? And he's also wondering, like, how much does, publishing papers actually play a role in your decision?
Well, I think, we all do try to be holistic in our evaluation. I mean, each one of these factors are important, and we do spend a lot of time with these applications. And so, in some person, you might be really impressed with the publications, and some other person, you might be more impressed with some of their community service. I don't think you can say one of them is more important than the others. It's a variety of parameters that create that the program directors and their committees look at to try to figure out who's attractive. So I think you have to be you and do the things that are your strengths, and believe in yourself and believe that people are going to appreciate it.
I always find that the letters of recommendation are some of the most helpful because, if you've been a program director long enough and you read letter after letter after letter, there's so much signaling that goes on within the actual letters. So when you find a letter that is authentic and genuine and from people that comes from the heart and is legit, that goes at least for me in our program, that goes a very far way, a very long way, regardless of give or take, what the board scores are, what the grades are, those letters really make a difference. And so that, to the students, it really kind of underscores the importance of having good sub-I experience and, making good relations, as well as having a really good show and put on a really good face when you do your interviews.
Dr. Brandemeier, I have a question from an IMG student. So the student wants to know if you're not able to do sub-Is in the US, like what else can you substitute for that to be competitive? And also, how do you suggest you try to stand out in the math process?
So, I'm just going to be pretty realistic. I know one colleague, and he was a co-resident of mine who matched in the standard match as an IMG without moving to the United States and doing a pre-residency fellowship first. And that was facilitated by a very long, productive international relationship between his home health system and our neurosurgery faculty. So his experience is not replicable unless you're from the same small country with the same tie-ins to the different programs. So the international graduates who I have seen be successful in the match, one category is Caribbean grads who do sub-Is in the US, because they can use a sub-I like what we've been talking about to stand out and make a good impression and that kind of thing. But if you don't have the opportunity to do sub-Is in the US, realistically, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get an interview. And my recommendation would be, and what I've seen people successful at, is doing a pre-residency fellowship where they have a history at that fellowship of getting people into the match or getting them into the residency program. Because I know several people who've gone that route who are now faculty neurosurgeons or well along in residency And in fact, one of the residents we're taking next year at WVU is our pre-residency fellow right now, who did a great job for us and is going to be a resident next year. So that's the best, most likely way as an IMG to get into neurosurgery residency. I think coming into the match as a fresh grad with no personal ability to do sub-I, I mean, unless you're the reincarnation of Harvey Cushing and can show it, it's going to be hard to make it happen.
I mean, I think that's a very honest response. You know, we have so many good U.S. applicants that it's very hard to evaluate a foreign medical graduate applicant because we don't know the quality of the education in many of these places. There's often visa issues which are complicated. And so, you know, I mean, it's just a fact of life. It's not that we don't want to evaluate it when equally, we do, but there are these other factors that we don't really know about. So if you're a foreign medical graduate, I think you have to really shine. I don't know if you have to be Harvey Cushing, but in fact, I'm not sure anyone would take Harvey Cushing. Apparently he was pretty crabby, but I think you do have to kind of over distinguish yourself in some way. And obviously if you're in the US and you do a pre-residency fellowship, yeah, that's one way to do it. But I think you have to be realistic that, you know, if you're a foreign medical graduate and you just kind of have an average sort of application, you're going to be at a disadvantage. I mean, it's just the way it is because of the factors that I'm mentioning.
Any other thoughts on that topic? All right. So the last question for this session is from a student that asks, what if you don't match neurosurgery and you go through the process, you have a stellar step 1 score, good number of publications, and unfortunately you did not match. What do you do next? Do you do a research year? Or do you do some other specialty and then try again?
Yeah, this is a sort of a tragic thing, and it happens to people that, you know, applicants that we kind of really feel good about, and maybe we just ranked them below where we went, and it's tough. It's tough. I think you have to ask yourself the very hard question: why didn't you match? Was it a strategic error? Did you only apply to the very most difficult programs and not, you know, take a wide berth of, or have a wide range of programs that you apply to, including some quote safeties? And some people do that. Some people, you know, they're pretty good, so they only apply to the top programs. And of course, you're in the Olympics then, right? All the people who are applying those top programs, you're going to get the very best of the best. So you might not match because you weren't strategic. You might not match because of a sub-I and you acted like a jerk. You might not match because you have a incorrect perception of the strength of your application. So I think you have to ask yourself that first and be honest enough. I mean, you can do another year and do one or another other thing, but I think you really need to ask yourself that first. Why did it fail? Go to some of your advisors at your medical school, go to the neurosurgeons there and, you know, ask them, hey, you know, be honest with me, what do you think happened here? If you just were strategically, you know, off, I think you can do either one of those things. I mean, some people try to do a general surgery, you know, kind of preliminary year and do really well. Some people will work in the lab and do really well. And I think all of us kind of look at that and say, okay, what did they do? But the first thing every program director is asking himself when you reapply is, why didn't this person match the first time? So that's the critical question you have to answer if that happens.
Yeah, and I would agree that you have to be able to answer that question and be honest with people about the answer. And it can't be an answer that blames everyone else. Like, there has to be a sense of personal responsibility and personal change that you're going to make. Because if you go into the second time, and you're like, I don't know why all of you PDs were silly, you were stupid, you didn't take me, it's all your fault. That's not going to fly. Like, it has to be you know what, I know it was my board scores, or I didn't have enough publications. I think I came across incorrectly. I maybe, I've made some personal growth, because there has to be a sense of personal responsibility. And then the next thing I tell people is, in some respects, the student who comes through a second time, no one wants, like, the first time is hard enough. A student who wants to do it a second time, there is a silver lining, and that silver lining is your dedication to neurosurgery is pretty high. Like, you're willing to go through this process again. And again, we're looking for people dedicated to the field. So, a student who goes through a second time needs to be able to shine and say, this is what I want to do. I know I have failings. I'm trying to correct those failings. But this is my passion. This is what I'm going to be good at. That can be a real selling point, but it won't work if you don't take this personal responsibility.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's students too who over the years, they don't match. And if they don't really be honest with themselves and look at the reasons why, and then they enter that match that next year, for their second time around before they correct the deficiencies on their first application, then they're really kind of shooting themselves in the foot. And so you do have to do some soul searching, and then you have to take the time if you're really dedicated to develop that part of the application before entering the match again, because it becomes even more difficult to match that second time around.
I also think that so if you don't match, again, you look at your application, you decide, what are the reasons? And if you truly believe you match, you should have matched, or you could match, that you should also engage somebody else to be sort of your cheerleader. I think that having a, program director or chairman or, faculty member that you've really worked with closely, like, be your advocate, and who's willing to call people up and say, hey, I don't know why this person didn't match. They're a star. I really like them. Or they, maybe their board score wasn't great, but you're missing out on somebody. I think that, if you're just sort of cast to the wind and it's like, I'm just going to reapply with the same stuff, your chances are very low. So I think having some kind of, not just yourself, but someone else to try to help be your advocate can help to make, your chances greater than already, unfortunately, kind of poor once you don't match once.
Thank you guys so much for the interest in talk and discussion. In the interest of time, we're going to move to Dr. Lazzaro's talk. I just wanted to thank the panel program directors again for doing such a fantastic job and keeping this conversation very interesting. Drs. Murad, Drs. Infinga, Dr. Baskin, Drs. Leonardo, Dr. Nair, and Dr. Brandon Meyer. Really do appreciate you guys giving your Saturday off to talk to us and have this very interesting conversation, especially for people like myself that are going to be applying for this upcoming cycle. And we are very grateful for you guys giving your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Virtual round of applause for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Feel
much.
free to share our contact information with folks attending this if they have further questions afterwards. Emails.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think all of us would be happy to communicate with applicants and, answer more questions. And, we're interested in you. It's what we do. So it's not that we're not interested. It's just a daunting process for everybody, both the program directors and the applicants.
Yeah, we'll definitely share that information with the students that attended, and we appreciate you guys once more. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody. All right, and I will turn it over to Kyle now to help introduce Dr. Lazzaro for the first clinical talk now on managing intracranial hypertension.
Okay, so our first talk today is going to be by Dr. Tyler Lazzaro, Relieving Intracranial Hypertension, CSF Flow Dynamics and Diversion. So Dr. Tyler Lazzaro is a PGY5 resident in neurological surgery at Baylor College of Medicine. He earned his BA and MD from Boston University before joining the residency program at Baylor. His clinical interests are in cerebrovascular and endovascular neurosurgery, From a research standpoint, his interests are in neuroprotection after acute ischemic stroke and endovascular device development. After graduation, he plans on complete a cerebrovascular endovascular fellowship at the University of Washington. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lazaro now.
Can you guys hear me? All right, cool. I guess I can't start my video, so you can't see my excited emotions on my face right now for the talk.
I think we just fixed that. You should be able to. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I wanted to get you wanted you guys to see how excited I am to be here right now, and excited to talk to you about this topic. Let me just share my screen for a sec. Yeah, I feel like everyone needs to take a little bit of a breather from that panel. A little anxiety provoking, I imagine. Everyone's like now thinking about the match, which is always pretty stressful. So I can understand that. But let's try to refocus and think about why we want to do this in the first place again, right?
Teach us how to relieve the pressure, all puns intended.
Yeah, we'll relieve the pressure for our patients and for ourselves right now. So you guys can see my screen okay? All right. We're gonna try to make this this talk as interactive as possible, so there will be some questions later. So the topic of my talk today is going to be relieving intracranial hypertension. I put it in quotation marks because you know, you don't always relieve intracranial hypertension by modifying CSF flow or diverting it, for example. And we'll go over some cases in which that is true. To really talk about both these topics, CSF flow diversion, intracranial hypertension, we have to go through a lot of different topics, some involving, frankly, some physics that I am not that keen about. But what I like to do in these cases is to learn from our patients. And I think that makes it a little bit more memorable for everyone. So I'm going to make everyone that's currently here an honorary Baylor resident right now. So congratulations, or I'm very sorry if we weren't very high on your rank list. You're on call right now. Okay, so congratulations. Oh God. That was louder than I thought it was going to be. Okay, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pull Everywhere, but see if you can pull your phone out and scan this for me. I'll give you a couple seconds for that. I'm timing you all right now. It's your first test as a resident. And see if you can answer the first question for me. Ah. I guess we can just do this. Can you guys see the responses also, or? Okay, good. I was trying this out yesterday and it wasn't working, and so I was a little nervous, but anyway, so it looks like, I don't know if you guys, hopefully you guys can see, but it's a good number of you that are in your later years of training. So I think a lot of this, what we're going to cover today is going to be very useful for you going into your sub-Is and your intern year. So let's see, you get your first page. All right, let's skip that because that was very loud. So this is what you see in your pager. Get code 1 trauma coming in, 5 minutes out. Looks like it's a pretty sick patient, 19-year-old male with a low GCS. So patient comes into the shock room and presenting after a motor vehicle accident, was a restrained passenger per the EMS. And here are his initial vital signs. So you're looking at his monitor. See the heart rate's 100, blood pressure is 146/81. He's a little tachypnic, saturation's a little low, 90%. He's got multiple facial contusions. His pupils are equal and reactive on your assessment, and you give him a GCS of 8. So I'm assuming that you all are familiar with the GCS. If not, quickly read this panel here, but he is just groaning to painful stimuli, not opening his eyes, and he is moving and localizing to painful stimuli. So he gets an 8. And he has no other injuries that you can see right now. He goes right to the trauma scanner and gets this scan. Okay. So what do you guys think is going on here? Well, these letters are this very jarring format. Okay, well, I see a lot of you guys are thinking about hemorrhage, edema. This is a good way of looking at it. One way of putting those two terms together is called a contusion, which you can see. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but right here, in this frontal area, you see some hyperdensity. When you talk about CT, you talk about density. We have this hyperdense area in the right frontal, potentially left frontal lobes, indicating a contusion with some subarachnoid hemorrhage. So here's the next question. What do you want to do for this patient? And feel free at any time, anyone can unmute and ask for clarification or anything like that. So just trying to keep this interactive. All right, so I'll let the responses keep trickling in, but most of you want to intubate the patient, which I think is exactly the right thing to do. So you always want to think in any situation, really, if there are any acute changes with your patient, you want to think ABCs, right? Airway, breathing, circulation. So you want to make sure that your airway is secure. And a patient with a GCS of 8 is very mentally impaired at this point. The airway is not protected. They need to be intubated first before doing anything. And honestly, that's the best thing to do from a TBI standpoint as well, because you're able to fully take control of the patient's respirations, controlling both the oxygenation and the blood CO2 levels. Yes, someone wrote less than 8 intubate. I'm glad. Just keep that in mind. All right. So obviously, some of you are very hungry. You want to get some snacks. You could do that if you want, but just make sure you properly hand off this patient. So here's your patient. You don't really see the contusions, unfortunately, but the patient's now intubated and admitted to your neuro ICU, and His heart rate's now 77, blood pressure 166/98. It's oxygenating well with the ventilator. Pupils are equal and reactive. His DCS is now 7T on your examination. After the paralytics and sedation wear off, you re-examine him. He's still localizing, and obviously it's 7 now because he's intubated. There's no verbal score there, so 7T. You start some medications. Now, what do you want to do now? He's in your ICU, and you're it. You know, what's the next best thing for this patient? All right. So the majority of you want to place an ICP monitor, which I think is a great idea. I would say some of you wanted to place an EVD, an external ventricular drain. And in this case, that's what I would do. I think either answer is correct. And in either way, you can get an ICP reading. You can transduce the ICP from an EVD or, you know, from a bolt. But in the case of an EVD, you can also treat the patient. So how do you treat them with an EVD? You can drain CSF, right? And we'll go over why that's helpful in treating intracranial hypertension. But in this case, I would place an EVD. I'll also go over some recommendations at this point, which I think will help you guys moving forward with how to think about these issues. And when you talk about trauma, you want to talk about the Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines, which I think get revised every few years, and really create a good consensus agreement on what to do in certain situations. In terms of ICP monitoring, there isn't good level 1 evidence. However, there's level 2B evidence, which suggests that they should get some kind of ICP monitor to reduce in-hospital mortality. Previously, they had more specific recommendations of placing an ICP monitor, including an abnormal CT with a low GCS or normal CT with a very low GCS and hypotension. At our institution, what we do is basically follow this abnormal CT and low GCS requirement. And the reason is we're looking for a diffuse brain injury or signs of diffuse brain injury that might evolve over time, and that you can really only get by examining the patient and also monitoring their ICP. Some of you may have already placed an external ventricular drain at this point. So I'll just be reviewing how to do that real quick. You place the position supine with the head of the bed up. It's typically called the Fowler's position. You have their head in a neutral position, and then you mark Coker's point, which is in this right frontal area. Make incision, do your twist drill, your dural opening, pass your catheter, and then you tunnel it under the scalp, which you can see sort of here. Attach your catheter to your manometer, and then you're good to go. So here's a question for you. How do you locate Coker's point? Honestly, the most important part of placing an EVD is the setup and where you're aiming. So if you mark the wrong spot and you're aiming for the wrong landmarks, then you're not going to hit the ventricle. It's going to be a very frustrating time for you. So let's think about some of the surface landmarks that we can use to help us make the right point and incision. And for some of you that have joined late, at the top of the screen, there are directions on how you can respond to these polling questions. All right, so there are multiple correct answers here, and many of you have chosen the correct answer, which is one of the correct answers, which is A. Typically, Coker's point can be found 10 centimeters from the nasion and 3 to 3.5 centimeters lateral to midline. Usually, you'd start on the right side. Obviously, you'd want to go through the dominant lobe if possible. However, you can also find Coker's point as long as you're anterior to the coronal suture and in the mid-pupillary line on either side. C is actually Keen's point, which is another safe entry point for ventriculostomies. Will typically enter the atrium of the lateral ventricle. And D is Fraser's point, which is an occipital entry point, which is often used in pediatric shunt placements. Very hard to do at the bedside because you have to have the patient either lateral or prone. And E is, I think, a quick and dirty way that some residents or some neurosurgeons do it. Kind of one of the methods that I use, if you take your finger and you know the measurements of your hand, then you can find Coker's point just by putting your hand on the patient. So if you put your index finger at the nasion, you put your thumb aimed to their ear, then right at that junction, a couple centimeters away in front of the coronal suture, you'll find Coker's point. And you got to make sure that when you're passing your catheter, and really this starts at the drill, you want to be aiming perpendicular to the bone. And if you need other landmarks to guide you, you can aim towards the contralateral medial canthus and the tragus laterally. So you can use those 2 points to help you, but if you aim perpendicular to the bone, it won't fail you. And this is an example of an AVD that I recently placed. Aimed in the right lateral ventricle toward the foramen of Monroe, which is where you want it. So after your EVD placement, ICP is transduced since 23. Exam remains poor, but stable. Just for a quick word, when you're looking up at the waveform, you're going to see 3 different waveforms, which grossly correlate with arterial waveform and arterial blood return to the heart. However, I have never found this clinically relevant at all. And so really the most important thing is your actual value here. And what do the Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines say about the pressure thresholds? Well, vaguely, they say that above 22 is associated with increased mortality. So you want to treat ICP above 22. And that some combination of the values that you're getting from your ICP monitor, imaging, and your clinical exam should help you make a decision about when to treat. It's helpful to take a step back and then look at the Monroe-Kelly hypothesis in this case. I'm sure many of you have learned about this a million times. Basically, your brain is has a fixed capacity, or your intracranial compartment has a fixed capacity. It's mostly taken up by brain parenchyma, but also by CSF and blood volume in a more minority proportion. And the reason why this is important to understand is because any increase in volume is going to increase intracranial pressure. And at some inflection point, you're going to have a dramatic increase in intracranial pressure and be at a high risk for herniation. And what's herniation? It's bad. Okay, herniation is when the brain moves to another compartment, another intracranial compartment where it's not supposed to be. Most commonly, you think of uncal herniation, which is where the medial temporal lobe herniates past the tentorium into the brainstem compartment, and you get brainstem compression, and it's potentially fatal. You can also have subfalcine herniation, which is brain from the contralateral frontal lobe under the falx. You can have upward herniation, downward herniation, or tonsillar herniation. All of these are a result of intracranial hypertension in a certain compartment of the brain, causing this displacement of the brain. And so here is your ICP waveform. Now you're looking up at your patient's monitor. And after the EVD placement, it's continues to be mildly elevated at 25/28. Here are his vitals now. Heart rate's 90, blood pressure 130/88. It's oxygenating well. Seems a little restless and is coughing. His pupils are equal and reactive. His exam remains GCS 17. And you get a blood gas. It shows his PCO2 is 38. So you're draining his CSF a little bit, and you raise his head of the bed, which is what you all learn to do immediately when you have a patient with a traumatic brain injury. Still mildly elevated. So what do you want to do now? So we'll let those responses trickle in. So most of you want to induce some level of hypocapnia and decrease the PCO2. Maybe you think the PCO2 of 38 is a little high. Some increased sedation, some mannitol. I don't think any of these are incorrect. If you do them, you will help the patient, and it will decrease intracranial hypertension. However, in this case, I think the best answer is to increase IV sedation. And the reason why is that it's a relatively low-tiered intervention, and we'll talk about the tiers of treating intracranial hypertension in the setting of TBI. And it can be, and it's a way of optimizing the patient for the long-term outcome. Inducing hypocapnia can only be done for up to 24 hours. You really want to do it less. Obviously, you hear about only transient hypocapnia. And the reason for that is because if you keep the patient at a low PCO2, they're going to eventually be at a higher risk for brain ischemia, because you're causing all of those cerebral capillaries to clamp down. Because as you know, the blood PCO2 is the biggest driving force for vasoconstriction in the brain. And then, giving mannitol is not the wrong answer here either. But again, this is one thing that if you're going to be trying to keep the patient's ICP down over the long run or over the next few days, you want to optimize some other things first. So in this case, I think it's helpful to have a paradigm for treating ICP in your mind. And this comes from a large consensus study across many trauma centers, including Baylor. And in general, you want to go tier to tier. So the first tier includes, managing their sedation, making sure that their PCO2 is at least normal. You can consider mannitol or hypertonic saline boluses, and you want to keep their cerebral perfusion pressure in the normal range. And also draining CSF is in this tier as well. So once you have your patient set up, you want to make sure that you're doing some of these things to get the ICP down. The next tier of intervention is actually providing more of a hypocapnic range, so 32 to 35. I would say even 30 to 35. And also neuromuscular paralysis. So a lot of times we use things like cisatracurium or Nimbex in intermittent doses to try to completely paralyze the patient, to prevent them from valsalvaing, coughing, things like that can raise their intracranial pressure. And if that's not working, you reassess the patient and you go to tier 3, which includes surgery and pentobarb coma. So here's our patient. After our interventions, our tier 1 interventions, he's ICP is around 20, which is right where we want it. However, the next day you notice that his blood pressure is now trending downwards. It's now 90/50. His heart rate's slightly tachycardic. His pupils are still reactive. His exam is still the same. You look for signs of bleeding from his face, from his scalp. You don't really see anything. It's not febrile at this point, and you're not concerned for sepsis. or at least you're not treating him actively for sepsis. And here are some of his labs. So his hemoglobin 7.1, hematocrit 23.3, platelets 117, INR 1.2, PGT 32. So you transfuse some blood, and after these 2 units of bloods, which are infused over about 2 hours at this point, or an hour and a half, his blood pressure is still 98/52. And you notice that he's requiring large doses of propofol to maintain his sedation as ICP, which remains well controlled, but he has this large propofol requirement. So what do you guys want to do? So let those results trickle in. So a lot of you guys want to get a CT of the head. Some of you want to place a central line to start vasopressors. So going back to our treatment algorithm or our tiered approach, if the patient's exam is the same and their ICP is well controlled, then these other investigatory interventions like CTs, probably not necessary. At this point, there are other things that we can optimize, and our primary focus is the hypotension. So I agree with placing a central line and starting vasopressors. The reason why that is we want to optimize the cerebral perfusion pressure. With a BP of 98/52, our cerebral perfusion pressure is probably around 50 or so, and we want to get it higher. And so we'll talk about why that's important. So the cerebral perfusion pressure is recommended to be maintained about over 60, and to have some way of measuring it in cases of severe TBI. And there's really no difference between increasing it much higher than that. In fact, you can actually cause hyperemia in the brain and perhaps increase the hemorrhage rate. So you want to keep it around 60. Let's take a step back briefly and talk about the physiology. So you've all probably seen this equation before. Cerebral perfusion equals the mean arterial pressure minus the ICP. Mean arterial pressure can be calculated from the systolic and diastolic blood pressures, and is about 2 times the difference over 3. And here you can also think about cerebral blood flow, which is slightly different. The cerebral blood flow is the actual amount of flow of blood coming through the brain at any given time, and that's calculated with a CPP minus cerebral vascular resistance, right? So the resistance that the blood reaches at the point of the arterial and capillary system, which is controlled, as we mentioned before, by the oxygenation blood CO2 levels. In an area of injured brain, most of the time, you have a breakdown of this autoregulatory capacity. And so the CVR is actually closer to 0. So in the end, your cerebral blood flow is directly related to your CPP or your MAP minus your ICP. So what winds up happening in the normal brain is if you get a low blood pressure, a low mean arterial pressure, you're able to sustain the same blood flow in this kind of wide range based on the autoregulatory capacity of the small blood vessels in the brain. However, when it's injured, this becomes more or less a linear relationship. And so it's very easy to fall off that slope in the normal range and go towards this area of hypoperfusion and ischemia, which is obviously not good for the patient long-term and will lead to poor outcomes. So our patient overnight now decompensates suddenly, and now is starting to extend to noxious stimuli only. ICP is also much higher, 25 to 32. You look at the heart rate, 60, ICP is 32, and the CPP is in the normal range on large doses of vasopressors now. Pupils are slightly unequal now, and the GCS is 4T, so they're extending. You notice that you're already hyperventilating them, causing a mild hypocapnia. and you're draining them. You gave mannitol, you gave Nimbex. Every hour now, ICP is still out of control. So what do you want to do next? So I'm just going to let the results trickle in here because I realize that I only have about 20 minutes left, but most of you want to obtain a CT head, which I agree with. We now have an exam change. We have poorly controlled ICP with our first and second tier interventions. So it's definitely time to reassess. So we're now more in this range here. And now we're going to our tier 3 interventions. And, you know, I think in a young patient, 19 years old, you have to give surgery a chance for these patients. You know, we're talking about long-term outcome here, and I just don't think there's the data for pentobarb as there is with a decompressive craniectomy. In preparation for that, here's your CT. So now we have a very different scan. The patient now has this large subdural hematoma on the left side, blossoming frontal contusions, some temporal contusions, and effacement of the basal cisterns. So this explains his exam change, and clearly now he's much sicker than he was before. So we're thinking about decompressive craniectomy, and the Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines recommend decompressive craniectomy for reducing ICP, which leads to a reduced mortality, but also increases the incidence of vegetative states. So these are all things to consider when you're counseling patients' family about this decision. You know, there's a chance that they may not get back to normal, a good chance that they may not get to normal in some cases when they have a severe presentation of TBI. So you really have to talk to the patient's family about this. And if you're gonna do a decompressive craniectomy, a large decompressive craniectomy is what's needed. So 12 by 15 for reference is the size of the palm of my hand. So when I draw out the patient's incision, I put my hand right there, and I draw my incision around it. And that'll give you your adequate skin flap and bone flap. So what that looks like for a right decompressive craniectomy in this example is a reverse question mark incision. At our institution, we don't typically take it down this far because you go this far in front of the ear, you might hit the superficial temporal artery, which is you can actually see it on this 3D here, is going to be the main blood supply for the skin flap. So you definitely don't want to take that down if you can help it. You want a huge bone flap. And the most important thing is that you get down to the floor of the middle fossa. So that's this gray striped area here. And that's going to be right behind the zygoma. And you're going to often have to use a combination of rongeur, drill to get down that far, but you really want to take the time to do that. And eventually you have this huge area of brain exposed and a large dural opening. And then you close the skin. Usually you put a stylastic sheath or a duramatrix on top of it to protect the surface of the brain, but you then close the skin over this and you have your decompression. So after the surgery, the patient's exam improves back to what it was. So he's localizing again. ICP is now 10 to 14, so much better. He starts to actually follow some commands intermittently. You try to extubate him, but you can't because of respiratory secretions, and his mental status is still a little poor, so you perform a tracheostomy. Just as a plug for our program, we also do all of our own tracheostomies in our ICU, most of them at the bedside at this point. And you also have a peg tube placed. We don't do our own pegs, but get the patient ready and is discharged home with the family, and he's awaiting cranioplasty. So that was a good save. So you're getting ready to go home after a hard day, after a hard few days saving this patient's life, and pager goes off again. What is it this time? Oh, another trauma. Okay, so it's 57-year-old. This time the GCS was 13 in the field, but she's combative. Vital signs seem to be normal. So she comes in, she was actually just struck by a car, so automobile versus pedestrian. And she's moving purposefully, but very agitated. In the shock room, heart rate 70, blood pressure is 180/98. Right pupil now is actually much larger than the left. And on your assessment, so this is different from what they found in the field, her GCS is now 6. So it went from 13 to 6. She's only now just withdrawing from pain. So you want to, or flexing from pain. So you want to, at this point, do your ABCs. You want to get through your trauma evaluation. Someone notes that she has an open tib-fib fracture. They also do a FAST, which is an ultrasound test of the abdomen to look for free fluid, which is negative. And then she gets intubated. So what do you want to do now? All right, so everyone wants to get a CT of the head, and I think that's the correct answer. For some reason, I've been asked this multiple times. When a patient comes in with a blown pupil and a poor exam that was previously okay, some trauma surgeon or something goes and says, shouldn't you just put a burr hole in or something like that? And if you were in the middle of nowhere and you had no access to, and you weren't in a hospital, you had no access to any imaging, then I think that would be the right answer. You know, you're doing what you need to do to save the patient's life, but in any urban setting, especially any hospital setting, get a CT of the head first. There can always be false localization with a blown pupil, as you can get with several herniation syndromes where you can have impingement on Kernahan's notch and a contralateral third nerve palsy, for example. So you don't want to, if you can get imaging, safely get it. So the airway secure, we get our CT head. And this is what it shows. So we have a large right-sided acute subdural hematoma with a lot of midline shift. So what do you guys want to do about that? Now you're in the scanner, you got to decide what to do. All right, so let's take the patient stat to the OR. I think this is a no-brainer at this point. And the reason why I put this case in is because we were just talking about placing EVDs for traumatic brain injury. However, in this case, to relieve the patient's intracranial hypertension, we're not talking about CSF flow diversion. We're not talking about placing an EVD to drain CSF. We need to get this huge mass lesion out of the head, right, to make room. So there are, in addition, Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines for this as well, which are mostly consensus. And so a lot of you will hear that acute subdural greater than 1 centimeter with a greater than 5 millimeter midline shift should be evacuated as soon as possible. Or in a patient who with a very poor GCS with slightly less subdural thickness and midline shift with a rapidly decreasing mental status should also be taken. And just briefly to go over that. You know, you'll have your patient positioned, usually supine with the head turned. In this diagram, they have them pinned. We don't pin for our trauma cranies ever because it's just a waste of time and also provides less flexibility for the scalp. And you make your reverse question mark incision, large craniotomy. Again, in this situation, with an acute clot, you don't want a small acute craniotomy because what you're going to find is this huge gelatinous mess underneath. So this is a case that I did not too long ago. Huge clot that we're just kind of sweeping off here, and then once we get it off, you find this, you know, the surface of the brain here, your large dural opening, and at this point. Is a good point to think about placing your EVD, or you can close up and place it afterward if the brain is swelling. You decide whether or not you put the bone back on, leave the bone off. These are all conversations for another time, but in general, once you get the subdural out and the brain looks okay and it's not swelling out, you can put the bone back on, usually leave an EVD. And if you're gonna place an EVD, you can place it through a point called Payne's point, which on the left side, unfortunately, goes straight through Broca's area. So you don't wanna do that necessarily. But what you can do is take that same point and go a little bit more medial and place it through the middle frontal gyrus or something right above that. So you're having a lot of fun now, right? In the OR, pager goes off again. Sorry about that. So you get another EC consult. This time is for brain mass for a 48-year-old with headache. So this patient comes in and they have worsening headache and nausea over a month. And over the last week, they've been vomiting now. And their partner notices that they've had some gait instability, particularly with some right-sided weakness. You go down to the ER and he's in this nice little room off to the side. No one's paying attention to him. The nurse is off doing something else because they're very busy. And he's now very lethargic. And you look at the monitor, his heart rate's 42, blood pressure 167/80, and heart rate's 20. His saturation's okay, 94%. Only opens his eyes with vigorous stimulation here. So you're rubbing his sternum, he's groaning to questioning, answers sometimes. Doesn't really follow commands, but he's kind of batting you away. And the pupils are equal, however. The physician, ER doctor, before they handed off this patient, was nice enough to order a CT head for you. So here it is. So what do you want to do next? All right. So a lot of you want to either intubate the patient, bring them to ICU, and then I assume place an EVD or just place the EVD. At our institution, actually, I would just place the EVD. So I bring him up. So his GCS, his mental status is a little poor, but he's protecting his airway somewhat. This is something that you just get a gestalt of over time. But you bring him to the ICU. In this case, you can place an EVD under local anesthesia. Usually we give no sedation or anything. You can have someone hold their head for you, place the EVD quickly, and then as soon as you place the EVD, he wakes up. So just 30 minutes after you place the EVD and drain 20 cc's of fluid, he's awake and alert. And then even a short time after that is following commands and is talking to you. And he reports that over the last month, he's had an unsteady gait and he has had some hearing loss. And his vitals have all normalized. You notice that he has some left-sided hearing loss. He's full strength, but he has a pronator drift and his gait is very unsteady. He has a positive Romberg sign. And you leave his EVD open at 0. So what does that mean when you leave the EVD open at 0? Well, you're leveling the transducer portion of the drainage system to the tragus, which we arbitrarily put as the 0 point of the brain. And why? Because it's in the middle. It's in the middle of everything. The foramen of Monroe, which is approximated by the tragus, the level of the tragus, is sort of the middle of everything. And that's where, if the pressure is very high, you're going to get your herniation syndromes, et cetera. So you want to level your drainage system to the ear. And essentially, you have a basic manometer set up with, a lot of you who are much better at physics than I am will notice that the pressure at the fluid level from one side is the same as the other side. So that's the point at which we're measuring. And when we're thinking about the pressure above that point, it is actually directly related to the height. And we have these very convenient units called centimeters of water, which is a pressure reading, but it also is, in fact, 1 centimeter of water per centimeter. So if you're looking to measure the pressure of a static system, so say you have your drain and it's not draining, and you raise it up and you have your meniscus of fluid in the tubing, at the point at which it's not moving, above the ear is your pressure in centimeters of water. So in this case, it's 10 centimeters of water. That's going to be your pressure. So if you don't have a fancy transducer, or it's not hooked up to a transducer because you don't feel it's necessary, and you want to get a quick pressure at the bedside, you take your drain tubing, you raise it up until it's not draining anymore, and then you measure the height in centimeters, and there's your pressure. So now the patient's stable. We get an MRI of the brain to see what's going on. We saw a little hypodensity before that, and we see this large, what winds up being a left vestibular schwannoma. And so in this case, we're talking about hydrocephalus. So we went from TBI and talking about intracranial hypertension. Now we're talking about hydrocephalus, which can also create intracranial hypertension. And a lot of times the classic teachings are all from the bulk flow model, which, has its issues, but is very clinically helpful. So you can think of hydrocephalus as an accumulation of excess cerebral spinal fluid, typically from either a blockage of the normal flow, overproduction, or underabsorption. Obviously, as I've mentioned, there are a lot of dynamic studies of the appendum at this point, which are pointing to sort of different models of the development of hydrocephalus, which I'm not going to go over. But you can get intracranial hypertension, obviously, which can result in herniation. So you want to treat this as soon as possible and effectively. And many of you have heard about the types of hydrocephalus: obstructive hydrocephalus, communicating hydrocephalus, normal pressure hydrocephalus. And this is another point to what I had mentioned before, which is that you don't necessarily have to have intracranial hypertension with hydrocephalus. And really what we're talking about is a clinical syndrome, which can be a number of things, related to your imaging findings, which is usually in large ventricles. So in our case, we took out the tumor. The reason why this tumor is causing hydrocephalus is because it's impinging on the fourth ventricle outflow. And you have, again, your CT on the right here showing your ventriculomegaly, which you can, grossly measure on your CT scan. There are a lot of different measuring techniques that have been validated. I have not really found it to be super helpful in these situations. But if you're looking to compare previous scans, you can just make those quick measurements. So your patient gets the surgery, does well. The pathology is consistent with the vestibular schwannoma. You leave your EVD open, after the surgery to help with wound healing. It takes diverts the CSF away from your wound, helps you to heal postoperatively. And then eventually many people will wean these off. And there's a lot of data out there also about the proper weaning techniques for this, subrectal hemorrhage, et cetera. Everyone has their own technique, but in our institution, we do a quick wean, clamp the EVD to monitor. The patient is doing well. The CT 24 hours after that looks good. We take the EVD out. So unfortunately, you're getting another page now. You just saved this patient's life again. And here's our last case. We'll go through it briefly. We get an ER consult from the Children's Hospital. They're very excited to have you come down and see this kiddo, who's actually 3, not 5. And they're presenting with a day of nausea, vomiting, fussiness, and they've had a shunt revision. They have a shunt from their chart. They've had preemie IVH, never had a shunt revision. So here we are, 3-year-old. Kid has a heart rate of 60, blood pressure 100/61. They appear drowsy but awake, not very interactive. They're sort of, hugging their mom. And you do a quick neurologic exam with what you can do. They're moving everything. And the CT scan shows this. Now, you don't have any other CT scans to show because they'd never gotten a revision before and there was no post-op imaging. But you do have their neonatal head ultrasound, which is before the shunt was placed, and this is what it looks like. So you can make some measurements based on that if you'd like. But just given the information so far, what do you want to do? In the interest of time, I'll just give you a second or so. So take the patient to the OR for shunt revision, I agree with. Tapping the shunt, measuring the pressure in the situation is not the wrong answer. Some people might prefer to do that. However, I think in the setting of relative bradycardia and a drowsy patient, obvious signs of shunt malfunction, I would just bring them to the OR for a shunt exploration. And one of the things that you can do in the absence of any comparison imaging is you can actually measure the ventricle size and ratio, called the frontal occipital horn ratio. It's calculated based on the diameter of the frontal horns, occipital horns over 2 times the head diameter. In this case, I didn't do the measurements, but the reading was about 0.6. So that is clearly in the abnormal range. And the shunt was explored. Patient did well after surgery and was discharged. So talking about pediatric hydrocephalus, which is a very different entity. In the developed world, the most common cause is actually intraventricular hemorrhage, usually of prematurity, followed by myelomeningocele and other spinal dysraphisms. aqueductal stenosis, and then in the less developed world, such as places like Africa, for example, you have post-infectious meningitis as a very high cause of as the etiology of hydrocephalus in most cases. But this is what you're going to see here. And just a brief word on shunt malfunction. It's a clinical diagnosis for sure. Anytime a radiology report comes back and says, the summary says shunt malfunction, that's just completely not in the purview of radiology. That's your job. So you go down, you see the patient, you look at the imaging, you make the diagnosis of shunt malfunction. You want to rule out danger signs first, such as bradycardia, sunsetting eyes, so inability to look up or an upgaze palsy, severe lethargy or comatose state. And then in a lot of cases, some additional information is requiring, such as a shunt tap, previous revision history. You have to admit the patient, maybe just observe them. Maybe they have an infection, and that's what's causing their drowsiness and vomiting. So you do have to keep those other things in mind, but you don't want to just write it off, because you're going to have the temptation to do that when you're resident. So, you're done. Enjoy your time off now. Throw the pager away. And thank you for listening. And this is just my shameless plug for our program, but this is the Ben Taub General Hospital, where you just did your call for the last week. And this is our level 1 trauma center. You can see the trauma bay below. It's a great place to learn. If you have any questions for me, you can email me. My email is in the right upper hand corner, or you can reach out to me through this training cramp group. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lazaro. That was really a nice talk, and thank you for making it interactive. That was a fun way to do it with the poll everywhere. So maybe we have a minute or two, for questions if anybody has. But if not, we'll just.
Yeah, I'm happy for questions.
Oh, it looks like there was actually one that came in, during the middle of the talk.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat. Says, do burr holes predispose for brain herniation with increased ICP? I think, it's probably not going to cause brain herniation in and of itself. However, you can cause additional bleeding, which can expand any kind of mass lesion. And the number one thing is that it's not an adequate enough opening to evacuate an acute clot. If the intracranial pressure is high enough, the brain will herniate out of any opening. So in a lot of penetrating trauma to the brain, for example, gunshot wound to the head, sometimes brain will be coming out of the hole. And in that case, that brain is gone. And you'll just, whip stitch the opening, close it, stabilize the patient, either bring them to surgery or place ICP monitor in the ICU. But burr holes in and of themselves aren't going to necessarily increase the ICP.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining. And I'll turn it over to Kyle now to introduce Dr. Bernardo.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. All right, so up next we have Dr. Antonio Bernardo. So Dr. Bernardo is Professor of Neurological Surgery and Director of the Surgery Innovations Laboratory for Skull-Based Microneurosurgery in the Department of Neurological Surgery at Weill Cornell Medical College. Through his extensive training in skull-based surgery, including as a fellow with Dr. Robert Spetzler at the Barrow, Dr. Bernardo has been a pioneer and expert in the application of microsurgical anatomy to skull-based surgery. Through his surgical courses, he has trained over 4,000 neurosurgeons and 35 fellows. In addition, he remains engaged in global neurosurgical education through FIENS and numerous international surgical societies. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bernardo.
Hi, I just want to check if can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. All right, thank you very much for introduction, and thank you very much for having me today. It's always a pleasure for me to direct to medical students and young surgeons. The topic today, let me share my screen because I had some problem with my screen today. Just I want to make sure it works. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, we see your desktop, and it looks like the PowerPoint just moved off the desktop. Oh, perfect. Now I see it.
All right, perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, so the topic of my of my talk today is principal cranial surgery approaches and techniques. I have a short time, so only 1 hour. So I try to squeeze as much as I can. This talk actually I did a couple years ago, I think, or last year, I don't remember, and I had more time. So I try to make sure that I can condensate as much as I can. I'm a skull-based and vascular surgeon. I consult in many countries, so I work in many different locations, and I collect skull-based and vascular cases. But I had the pleasure to work with the FIENS organization in 20 years ago, and I spent a year and a half in Peru and in different countries in South America, and that was a life-changing experience for me. So I realized how much I could make a more impact just not only in doing surgery, by teaching. So now I commit much of my career, my time teaching, and I managed, after being in different locations. One of them was the BNI, and I managed finally to put together a nice teaching lab in a training facility at Cornell, where we teach people that come from all over the world, and usually they spend some 3 to 6 months with us, up to 1 year. And I have a lot of people from the US as well. And it's a great environment just to refine the surgical skill and to learn the anatomy. And I can say I've been training so many people around the world, and I've been working in so many locations, side by side with so many surgeons, that I think I can provide some advices to young doctors, again, just approaching the specialty, or they're thinking of approaching this specialty. And I condensate in this. I call that pearl, but it's very important that we really need to understand. It comes from my experience mostly. The first one, I say, remember the complication. First of all, complication never come alone. I have some people around tells me, oh, I was so careful. I dissect so far away from the facial nerve. I have facial nerve palsy. I mean, nobody should be surprised that you have a complication. It means you've done something wrong. So the most important thing is learning from what we have done in the past, and trying to learn from this complication to avoid to make the same mistakes again. The other thing, be realistic about your technical skills. We should never go beyond what we think and feel is our true capabilities, because otherwise we can make enormous mistake. And that comes from a profound knowledge of the anatomy. That's why I always emphasize constantly to young people around the world in any course I go, and it sounds obvious, but anatomy is extremely important. Starting from a medical school, and after that, you need to remember the anatomy takes on different perspective when you're trying to apply that book anatomy on a patient. So spending some time in the lab is extremely important. Practice surgical skills, refine skills, because some of these approaches are very complicated, and it's unthinkable imagining just to learn these approaches in OR setting or environment. OR setting is very stressful. So you really want to make sure you can refine your skill in a microsurgical lab. And unfortunately, I see even in my lab, where fellows that come from all over the world, that these people take time off for their medical practice to spend time in the lab. And unfortunately, the people that are in, for example, from my service, and unfortunately, our residents are extremely busy clinically, so I don't have enough time to spend a lot of time in the lab. So sometimes I always push them just to, even in research here, trying to make sure you spend some months, wherever you are, if you have a lab or whatever, just so I can go somewhere else, trying to spend some time in the lab is extremely important. Be extremely familiar with the instruments available. It sounds something obvious, but it's not that obvious. I learned that one on my own expense, because I remember the first time I was in South America, I had the aneurysm rupture, and all suddenly I was presented with a tool. I had no idea what it was. It was something completely I was not familiar with. That was a little dramatic, so I had to work around it. So since then, I learned my lesson now, and I always make sure that I'm familiar with everything I'm going to use. The other thing that sounds obvious, but it's not that obvious, is trying to avoid as much as we can brain retraction. It sounds very obvious, but usually I see so many times around people think that surgery has been successful just because the patient leaves the hospital just moving the limbs and be oriented in space and time. And we think we've done an incredible job. Now, I think we should really care about the cognitive function of our patient once they leave the hospital, which is not something we see immediately, but something actually happens in the future for this patient. That's why what really affects that feature is the brain retraction, how much we manipulate the brain of the patient. And that's not something that you can see obviously when the patient leaves the hospital in the immediate post-op, right? Master the use of surgical microscope. Now there's so much technique out there. Surgical microscope has been almost replaced by other tools like exoscope, endoscope, whatever used for visualization. We really make sure we use it the best. Be humble. I say this all the time to my fellows, to my residents. We are not doing basketball, we don't do soccer, we don't do football. We are not divas, so we don't need to care about the great technical gesture, but only we care about incredible clinical result. People are going to judge not your gesture, but they're going to judge you by how good you've been as a surgeon by your clinical result, okay? And always taking minimalistic approach. I say because when I first started skull base, there was a trend all over the world to be extremely aggressive. There is no need to be that aggressive. There is no need to show how good you are, no macho, but consider always the simple solution and avoid the grandiose options. Sometimes what's best for you might not be the best for the patient, and your intellect should control your emotions. So always be rational and always thinking that there's a patient on the table, right? So now I want to use some animation. I used to work on these animations since I was at the bar of many years ago. I don't have more time, but I still use them. These animations are very long. They date back 20 years. But it's good to have an overview of the approaches. Basically, I tell always my fellows they need to have more eggs in the basket. They don't need to do one single approach because that's the only approach they know how to do. That's why I always emphasize with young guys just to go to the lab, train. During your training, trying to learn as many approaches as possible. And then yourself, you decide which one will be best suited for that particular patient. And this very valuable time you spend in learning this stuff now, that once you are in your clinical practice, later on in your career, it's very difficult you're going back to the lab or you're going back to learn these approaches. That's why you'll be a little limited in your armamentarium. So that's a good time to do it. I'm trying to do, again, I'm trying to squeeze in this time the most I can. We start from anterior approaches, as you can see here, there is a lot of variations. So if I want to talk about all these variations for each single approach, it will take me an hour only for each single surgical perspective. So I try again to make it a little short so that we're going to see the purely anterior approaches with the subfrontal and supraorbital. We're going to see anterolateral, which is the most important, is the pterional approach. Some modification of pterional approach, like a frontal-orbital zygomatic. And I'm going to mention a couple of variations as well. And then we're going a little bit more lateral. Sorry. And being more lateral in this approach, and we're going to consider all the transpetrosal, subtemporal, anterior petrosal, posterior petrosal. And then we're going to go posterolateral, retrosigmoid, and some of the posterior transpetrosal approaches, the far lateral. We won't have much time. I would like to see if we can cover also the supracerebellar infradentorial, interhemispheric, and some of the transcallosal approaches. But to make it short, the three most important ones we use mostly for skull base are the anterolateral, mostly the orbital zygomatic with all the variation, the lateral, the transpetrosal, and posterior, mostly the far lateral approach. With these three approaches, you can gain access to the entire skull base. So from the entire clivus, from the top of the clivus, namely the posterior clinal process, all the way down to the foramen magnum. So these three major approaches, which I really suggest anybody to master. This is not something for a pure skull-based surgeon. Everybody, I think, should be able to get familiar with these approaches. You can gain a good exposure to the most difficult challenge in pathology, particularly at the base of the skull. And I'm going through the OR setup, something that you guys are familiar because you've been rotating through the OR. Surgical table is very important. Electric, I use a lot because I like moving the patient. That's why it's important to secure the patient properly to the table, because you want to be able to move that table a lot, because that's a way to increase exposure, avoid brain retraction, and overtaking obstacle. Surgical position is something I spend a lot of time with my fellows and my young residents, because if you just do a good positioning, if you position a patient properly, your life is going to be much easier. The most common one is the supine approach, the lateral approaches, a lateral positioning, of course. And the idea is just always say all the time, to keep the vertex down as much as you can. In this case, particularly in the supine for anterior approaches, anterolateral, vertex down 15 degrees. But it's important next extending. The head is always to be above the heart, because you want to avoid blood pooling in the brain and makes every dissection a little bit more difficult, brain swelling. So you work a lot with anesthesiologists. It's important, remember, it's a teamwork. Make sure the airways are always clear. And the problem is just make sure that the head is in the most neutral position. Even if you rotate the head on the other side, it's important to understand you don't want to cause any occlusion or partial occlusion on the vessel on the other side, because otherwise it will cause a venous engorgement, particular common sinus, the venous plexus around the vertebral artery, for example. It makes the surgery real complicated. But the major point of good positioning is to avoid obstacle, to go around the obstacle, and trying to minimize brain retraction, so and maximize exposure. Though I will go through some of these positions as we talk about the approaches, but just to understand what I think the most recommended approaches, the one I recommend the most, are the basic one for all intracranial procedure would be the supine and the lateral oblique. I don't like mostly the prone, or some people like even the supine when they use, for example, suboccipital approach. But in that case, you need to rotate the head too much. So when I do suboccipital posterior fossa, I always use a lateral position, like so-called park bench. I do some modification of this approach, which I'll show a little bit later. Usually I put the arm under the table to avoid brachial plexus injury. But this allows me to put the head in the most neutral position. Instead of turning the head too much on the other side, that will cause some venous engorgement. I rotate the body of the patient, so in this lateral position, as you can see. So that's my preference. But again, everybody's on his own preference. Let's start from purely anterior approaches. This is a subfrontal approach, which is a very good approach. You can see in this, again, is overviewing. It could be like unilateral, could be bilateral. You can involve the supraorbital rim or not. There are different variations. I'm going to mention a little bit of this one. But as far as the exposure area is very good, because you can expose the entire anterior canal fossa, the sella, and with a bilateral extension as well. So it's a very good approach for craniopharyngioma, planus-sphenoidal meningiomas, and some aneurysm of the anterior circle, particularly, for example, ACOM or A1, even A1 on the other side. So it's a very good approach, and it's very basal as long as you learn how to shape the supraorbital rim. The head, as you can see in this case, is at least 15-degree vertex down. In this picture, as you can see very well, I would extend the neck a little bit more, because the head, remember, has to be above the heart. All right, so that will avoid blood pooling and brain swelling. But again, just the fact that you position with the vertex down allows the frontal lobe to fall back even that centimeters is important to just minimize brain retraction. So all these tools are extremely essential. And then you can see the different option for a unilateral subfrontal approach. One is the purely basal without touching the supraorbital rim. The second one is involving the supraorbital rim. These allow minimize even further the need for brain retraction. This is very good option, and it's important to train for doing this one, because if you do properly, cosmetically is acceptable as well, as long as you know how to replace properly, and you don't want to drill too much bone after you've done the approach, otherwise it would be difficult to fill the gap. That's why it's good to plan this approach before you start opening, all right? The other option is including the bilateral extension. In this case, we can see we go on the other side as well, and that allows you to just gain more exposure in the anterior fossa. The dura opening, once you're done, in this case, the supraorbital rim has been removed. That allows me to be very basal, and then I had to apply a very minimal brain retraction, unless I had a big tumor to deal with. But for an aneurysm, for example, I apply a minimal brain retraction if I take the supraorbital ring. The dura opening, usually I keep a basal flap, so I reflect the dura inferiorly, and that allows me to go along the base of the skull all the way down to, you can see the anatomy, very nice. You see the chiasm, for example, and you can take out a tumor, debulk the tumor. The bilateral craniotomy is important when you have a big extension of the tumor. That one is a little bit more invasive because you have to enter both frontal sinuses. So reconstruction techniques very important, particularly use a pericranial flap to close or obliterate the frontal sinus. And you can see in here the superior subject sinus being ligated and cut, but this is an incredible view of the entire anterior fossa. So it allows you to minimize the brain retraction, as you can see in this case, right? So, I mean, the price you have to pay is you stick like the supraorbital rim. If you have a good training, you are capable of doing it. Now, this is very trendy nowadays. We go towards an era in which we try to be as minimally invasive as possible. The supraorbital approach, one typical example in which can minimize the bone resection. This would be almost the equivalent of unifrontal subfrontal, but the only thing, the bone dissection is very minimal. That allows you to be lateral to the supraorbital notch, and that means that you will avoid entering the frontal sinus in most of the cases. So that eliminates the brain retraction, minimize brain retraction, improve visualization, so you have minimization of tissue trauma, and improved cosmesis. The craniotomy requires only one burr hole, which is a very strategically placed, and I don't know how familiar you are with this one, but I'm going to go through this most strategic burr hole when we talk about the Pythagorean approach. So reduce the postoperative scarring and preserve cosmesis, and also minimize brain retraction. I always emphasize over and over, because that's why I teach my fellows at resident to use the spatula the least they can. And sometimes in my lab, I have fellows and residents work for a month and a half, only extradural, because I want them to really understand the concept of working extradural and preparing corridors. Because if they really manage to preparing corridors, they will be very successful in minimizing brain retraction when they open the dura. So with the supraorbital, which is a minimal bone opening, without extending as much as unifrontal, you can have access to the entire, not entire, but most of the anterior skull base, suprasellar region, the proximal sylvian fissure, the circular Willis, the anterior circular Willis, basal frontal temporal lobes, and the upper ventral midbrain. So there is some modification you can apply. Technically, it's going to be a little bit more challenging than through a Pythagorean approach, because the opening is a little smaller. But the contraindication would be patient with a large frontal sinus, of course, because in that case, I would rather do a bigger approach, because you lose one of the advantages of doing such a minimal opening. I don't want to go too much into technical aspects, so I go very briefly. The incision is inside the eyebrow, as you can see, and then I can do, in this case, when I go through the muscle, and I do a so-called a pericranial flap. Basically, I incise the periosteum, and I reflect the periosteum inferiorly. And then finally, once I reflect, as you can see in here, the periosteum inferiorly, and now I can do the craniotomy. It's a minimal craniotomy starting from the just posterior to the zygomatical frontal suture. I go very basal. I stay lateral to supraorbital notch. There's no need to violate the supraorbital notch, supraorbital nerve. No need to violate the frontal sinus in the majority of cases. And you can see it's only 2.5 centimeters above, and that allows me to go very flush with the roof of the orbit. Sometimes, actually many times, I take the supraorbital rim, because that allows me to be even more basal and to apply minimal brain retraction. As you can see, once I open the dura, usually I do the dura flap inferiorly, and I go along the opening basal, and I can get really beautiful exposure. You can see this nice view of the edge of the craniotomy, starting from the McCarthy burrow, which is just behind the zygomatical frontal suture. And with a craniotome, I can take the supraorbital rim together with the bone flap all together, and I can reconstruct properly with the cranial plates. And look at that degree of exposure. Although the opening is very small, but you have a nice angle, particularly on the entire unilateral anterior cranial fossa, some of the bilateral cranial fossa, but most of the cellular and pericellular region. So usually I say the limit, the cutoff of this approach as far as exposure in the paracel area is the carotid bifurcation. So everything lateral to the carotid bifurcation, as you can see here, particularly MCA, I won't suggest. So although you can do eventually push your limit, but for MCA, I would definitely use the pterygium approach, noise supraorbital. There is no need. So everything lateral to the carotid bifurcation, I won't use the supraorbital. That's what I mean. I mean, you have to be very honest and not
Initially,
just because you want,
pterygium approach was
you want to promote some of these. You just need to do absolutely, because you mark that one as minimally invasive. We have to be very honest, and then this different approach is better. The pterygium approach is the most popular of the neurosurgical approaches, being popularized mostly by Yazarville in the 60s, early in the 70s, and is very good for many pathology: aneurysm, olfactory groove meningioma, cavernoma, anterior mesiotemporal region, temporal horn tumor, clival chordoma. There's a long list of lesions you'll be able to access with the pterygium approach. And the exposure, as you can see,
the main limitation
intradurally is still a little complicated because the corridors are very small,
the target,
and then it's difficult to work properly between these corridors, right? So we have different maneuvers that allows us to increase these corridors. And I'm going to show only a few of them because that would take a lot of time, but that's what we do in the lab. We train fellows to release the structure and open up those corridors. The skin flap is the most simple way of doing skin flap is just one single layer. This can be, there's so many different variations nowadays, even a mini pterional. So, but the classic approach, you go 1 centimeter anterior to the tragus, and then you just go the head superiorly across the superior temporal line, and usually go in without staying behind the hairline for aesthetic, for cosmetic purposes. And you try to avoid, of course, the frontalis branch of the facial nerve. As you can see, and you come across the parietal branch of the superficial temporal artery. The most important thing when you do this, you want to really spare the main trunk of the STA, because you can use that one as a donor for a bypass, just in case you need it. The incision goes through the entire layers all the way down to the bone, and I reflect everything anteriorly, and incising the temporalis fascia as well. When we do the orbital zygomatic approach, because you have to go all the way down to the zygomatic arch. So usually I try to stay in between the fascias, so underneath the fat pad. So in that case, allows me to preserve the frontalis branch in the frontal or the facial nerve. You can see that the bone flap is as basal as possible. I try to as basal as possible, always to avoid retraction. Of course, if I had to do a mini pterional, I'll do the incision a little bit smaller, just saying cross with pterional is the most important part. So if I do a mini pterional, I don't need to go all the way crossing the superior temporal line. So I limit my exposure to the pterion. But now it allows you just to afford you a minimal exposure, and mostly I use for MCA and onions, for example. Otherwise, I just go basal across this one, and I want to expose both temporal, part of the temporal lobe and part of the frontal lobe. The single entry burrow is so-called the McCarthy. McCarthy, whether you use a perforators or whether you use a regular drill with a cutting burr, I usually tell people you don't want to aim into the orbit, man. You aim intracranially, because you want to see the intracranial dura. You don't want to see the orbit. Unless you're doing orbital zygomatic, usually the single burrow usually encompass both regions. You want to see on one half, you want to see the orbit, periorbital, and one half, you want to see the intracranial dura. But this one, for a typical pterional, you aim intracranially. So after you've done this first burrow, and you can go around and just do the entire craniotomy with the craniotomy. And understanding how to use a drill is extremely important. That's why I always invite young doctors to spend time again in the lab to get familiar with the drill, because the drill is an incredible, powerful tool, allows you to really expose the best just by retracting the, cutting the bone instead of retracting the brain. But if you don't know how to use it properly, if you don't have a good confidence with the drill, you can cause a lot of damage. That's why it's the speed drill, particularly understanding the difference between cutting and diamond, extra coarse diamond, location in which the drill can slip, and those are very, can slip, but those are very, very dangerous, because you really want to master the use of the drill. And the only can do is spending hours and hours and hours working with the drill. And finally, you can see the bone flap is elevated. Once it's elevated, you want to just flatten down. Again, use a cutting board, flatten down the sphenoid ridge. That allows you to be as basal as you can. Once you open the Sylvian fissure, you can really minimize, again, the spatula on the temporal lobe and frontal lobe. So basically, the same concept, the skull-based surgery, which we inherited from skull-based surgery, but now every neurosurgeon should apply, it trying to be able to drill down some structures and allow us to improve the visualization. So mastering the use of drill is very important. The dura opening is a different way of doing it. The classic one was popularized by Isaac Gilles, mostly used a C-shaped curvilinear incision and goes all around. You can see from temporal to frontal lobe to the temporal lobe, and then you reflect the dura anteriorly with some suturing. Or the other thing would be doing a linear, like a L-shaped incision, the first segment of incision along the Sylvian fissure, and the second one is like a L going into the planum sphenoidale. That is a different fascia, allows you to protect the brain and the frontal lobe, particularly with the spatula, and the dura is still on top of the frontal lobe. There's some advantage, some disadvantage, but it's good to use both sometimes according to what you're trying to achieve. The other thing is extremely important, understanding the anatomy of the cistern. The cistern anatomy is very, very important because once you release the arachnoid, which is embracing the cistern, you allow the brain to relax, and you can use actually the gravity. So there is no point of positioning a patient properly if you don't take advantage of the gravity. So good positioning, vertex down, but cleaning the arachnoid and open up the cistern is an incredible tool to relax the brain and allows you to put less spatula. And as you can see, I always mention less spatula because everything I do, everything I prepare extradurally, intradurally is the main target to apply less spatula as possible. Right? And finally, you can close the dura in a watertight fashion, and then you can apply the bone flap, which usually trying to make sure that you don't have to drill any extra bone. If you do have to drill some extra bone, you can close the defect with a methacrylate or with a mesh. Basically, I try my best not to avoid to leave any gap around. And finally, you can close the fascia. And sometimes you have to apply drainage. Most of the case, I don't, but it's an old style, and some people still use it. It's never wrong. There is a lot of modification. That's why I try not to be dogmatic, but there's many ways you can differentiate, you can modify this approach. The mini pterygium already mentioned before. There is another one, the frontotemporal orbital, frontotemporal zygomatic. Frontotemporal orbital zygomatic is like a building block, stepwise dissection, which or any approach you add a little bit more, a little component. And that allows you just to, again, the goal is maximize exposure, minimize brain retraction. For example, this is a typical orbitotomy. Basically, I don't do the orbital zygomatic as I used to do before. I do much less frequently because I don't need to. So what I instead do the full orbital zygomatic, and that allows the patient to go back home sooner, allows the post-op, minimize post-op complication, and the patient is back in the regular routine much faster. So what I do, I take the roof of the orbit instead of doing the full orbital zygomatic. Sometimes when I don't need to work intradurally, but mostly extradurally in middle fossa, I don't do the full orbital zygomatic, I take only the zygoma. So I take the zygoma anytime I want to lift the temporal lobe, or I'm planning to lift somehow temporal lobe because I need to expose, for example, cavernous sinus, or sometimes the sphenomeningioma mostly located and extended in the middle fossa. I take only the zygoma without completing with the orbital part, right? So you can tailor the approach. You don't need to do the whole approach all the time. Sometimes the mini pterional, I use mostly mini pterional only for insular lesion, or particularly if I'm dealing with the vascular, if I'm dealing with MCA. So something, as I mentioned before, which is lateral to the carotid bifurcation. In that case, I can use the mini pterional because I don't plan to go as basal, but I just open the Sylvian fissure and I'm located there. The other thing which I used to use much more before, again, I use much less, but it's a very beautiful approach because it really allows you maximize the exposure. And that's basically encompassing the pterional approach, including the supraorbital rim and the zygoma, basically, the zygomatic part and zygomatic arch. The surgical position is the same as the pterional, so the vertex down 15 degrees. The only thing is the head is a little bit more rotating on the other side because the middle fossa involvement. The first I do in 2 pieces, but it's equally good. You can do it 1 piece. I prefer to do 2 pieces, one because I have better control intracranial. So when I do the first part, would be the same pterional as we've seen before. Temporalis muscle is inflecting inferiorly, and trying to avoid this bulk of the muscle as much as you can. And after I've done this pterional approach, I can address the orbital part in the zygoma. And I need to learn, I need to really understand some surgical landmarks, particularly understanding the anatomy of the superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, because in the superior orbital fissure, there are so many neurovascular structure you don't want to injure. So understanding the anatomy very well is a little goes beyond the book anatomy. You really want to understand its anatomy on a simulation in the lab, possibly with a cadaver, because the anatomy takes on a different perspective because the patient is upside down. So sometimes for some people it's much easier to get oriented upside down. Some people a little bit more difficult, a little bit more training. That's why I always suggest to spend time with a cadaver. Right? And the other thing I really suggest when we do this approach, to do the orbital incision as deep as possible, always trying to avoid complication. And cosmetic complication nowadays is very important. You want to really keep an eye on those ones. So if I do the incision, the dissection as deep as possible, the orbit will have a good support, because one of the complications of the zygomatic post-op complication is the enophthalmos, because the eye doesn't have enough support because you drill so much bone, so the eye basically fall back. And that's not very pleasant for a patient. So I do my best to avoid that. So I do these bone cuts as deep as possible that will support the eye and avoid me that complication. You can see some books, some articles, sometimes we exaggerate. You can see in here is within the superior orbital fissure. But if you really go to the superior orbital fissure, there are a lot of structures, so you have to be careful, right? And the first cut, I usually do these talks in 3D. In our lab, we do so many courses there in 3D, fully massive, so with the glasses. It's beautiful to understand the depth, but you can see, unfortunately, I cannot show it on Zoom, but you can see in this like little fuzzy, the picture is not extremely clear. The first cut, the root of zygoma. The second cut on the zygomatic bone. The third cut is on the lateral wall of the orbit, as you can see here, all the way into the inferior orbital fissure. The fourth cut is in the supraorbital ring, all the way down to the inferior orbital fissure. And finally, the fifth and sixth cut are intracranially. So I come across the sphenoid ridge, and finally I can lift the orbital zygomatic piece, as you can see in here. And that's the final approach, basically. So you can see the entire zygoma is cut to this level, just before the zygomatic frontal foramen. And you can see down here into the orbit, the root of the zygoma, and finally the entire piece taken out. And after that, the orbital apex need to be drilled out because I need to expose the superior orbital fissure. That allows me to unlock the structure, open up the corridor, and so that allows me to apply less brain retraction. Dura opening is the same. And then we have the pericavernous, transcavernous route. I don't have much time, so I want to just go through the main concept of this variation. So the pericavernous, basically what I do, I mobilize the carotid artery, I cut the distal ring, so I mobilize the carotid, I open up the porus oculomotoris, I mobilize the oculomotor nerve. So these two maneuvers allow me to open up this corridor. So this allows me to go, for example, retroclinal for retrocellular pathology, if I'm dealing with the basilar artery or upper petroclinal pathology, to open up so this corridor. And even if I'm dealing with the pericellular region, I have much more space. So learning, that's something we learn from skull base. Learning how to do this little modification, open up the corridor, it doesn't force you to work in very tiny space, which is always a potential cause of complication. So that's what I call pericavernous route, right? Now we have the transcavernous route, which is very challenging. It's possible to do if you do a lot of training. Mostly transcavernous you can do intradurally, So this, you can see the first pictures here is intradural. The second one will be intra-extradural, and the third one will be completely extradural, right? So if I go through the cavernous sinus, it'll be possible to get all the way down to the clivus, right, mid portion of the clivus. So I just go this very quickly, so we'll have more time to see a couple more approaches. I just go through it quickly, please. For example, the anterior canal process is something very important to drill, because, for example, if you're dealing with the vascular pathology, is partially covered by the present anterior canal process. And the other thing, because the carotid is very much related to the anterior canal process, if you drill this one, you can mobilize the carotid artery. There is two ways to do it. You can do extradural or intradural. Extradural, of course, you preserve the brain tissue because there is the dura covering the brain. But I will never do extradural if I'm dealing with the pathology around the clinoids in this case, for example. In this case, I will do intradural. So intradural, I do a dura flap on top of the anterior canal process, and I drill the process with a cutting board or a diamond, depends. But this one, again, you need to be really confident with the drill, spend good time to refine your skill in the lab, because look how the relation with the neurovascular structure all around. In this case, supracranial PCA, ICA, and there's an ion as well. Posterior cranioidectomy is still something, look, is on your way. If you come from anterolateral, like in the pterygium perspective, is on your way to the upper clivus. For example, taking down the posterior canal process allows you a much better visualization of what's going on behind the retrocell, behind the dorsum cell. Look, you see a typical view. Let me see if I can make this one work. Yeah, this is very nice. You can see, I used to do this animation a while back, but you can see if I take the anterior posterior canal process down, you can have a beautiful exposure to a lesion, potential lesion at that level. Usually I take the posterior canal, the top of the clivus in between the two clinoids. That comes from the knowledge of the anatomy, because I know exactly the posterior canal process, the cavernous sinus is discharging into the superior pectoral sinus. So if I start drilling in this level, I'll have more bleeding. So I start in between first, and then I address the lateral component. So, and then I have a beautiful exposure all the way down to the iliac, as you can see. So it's a very nice way of just using the drill and then expanding your exposure. Right? The other thing which I want to show, this is, for example, is a supraorbital rim has been taken out. That allows me to change the trajectory, particularly if I have a supracellular lesion, or in this case, for example, is a high-riding basilar artery aneurysm is going above the dorsum cell. As you can see, this dorsum cell is going above it. So in that case, if I take down the supraorbital rim, allows me to incline the trajectory all the way up, right? So that taking the orbital rims allows me to go a little bit more superior. That's why I do the supraorbital rim without taking the zygoma on. So that's, you can see in this case, okay, and this is the dorsum cell, the high-riding basilar artery, and just by taking down, I can change the trajectory. Allows me to be a little bit more basal. And then you can see once I take the posterior clinoid, I have a much better visualization of the upper third of the clivus all the way down to the iliac. So these maneuvers we inherited from skull-based surgery, I think everybody has to be familiar. This is some animation I use particularly for working with our residents, because you can see around, once I take all these bones, and this is exaggerating, I take the anterior canal process, posterior canal process, you can see the entire anatomy of the cellular pericellular region. So you can see the basilar tip, you can see the PCOM, you can see P1, P2 on this side. I can see also P2 on the other side. I can see the pituitary gland, pituitary stalk. So I can have a beautiful look around. This is supratentorial, this is infratentorial. So you differentiate the supra from infratentorial. This is going to be the cavernous sinus with the oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, the third, V1, which is lacrimal frontal. And you can see the sixth nerve behind. This is the distal dura ring, carotid can be mobilized. This is a beautiful view to maximize this. You can see how we maximize this exposure by taking down bone, basically. And then you close with your cranial plates, trying to fill any defect with metacrylate. And natural, not to leave any gap. The other approach, which is very common, but not many people use it, subtemporal, because although technically it's very simple, it can cause some complication. Complication they come from lifting the temporal lobe. Anytime you try to manipulate the temporal lobe, you can cause either epilepsy or you can cause a venous infarct anytime you're trying to coagulate the bridging vein between temporal lobe and the sinuses. So technically it's very simple approach. It's not complicated, but the problem in the manipulation of temporal lobe, it makes like many people prefer not to use it. But there's a way around. If you just apply even to this approach, look, this is a typical subtemporal. You can go as basal as you can, but the other tip is just taking the anterior, the petrous apex, basically, you know. And again, as I mentioned before, you want to have more eggs in your basket. So if you decide in this case, some cases you cannot do orbital zygomatic for different reasons, I'm not going to enlist all of them. In that case, you want to use a more lateral approach. That's why I always emphasize young people, young surgeons, just to learn any kind of surgical perspective, and then they decide which one would be best suitable for that particular patient. The position is still the same. The concept is the same, although the head is more rotated laterally. Look, because I want to keep the head as neutral as possible, so I prefer to put a pillow on this side. So I just lift a little bit the shoulder on this side, trying to avoid too much rotation. The skin incision, this is just a dogmatic, but usually I use a linear incision or a lazy S more than this one. This is just to show what you can accomplish. You want to be as basal as possible, all the way down to zygomatic arch. And you can see the position, vertex down, because that allows you to use gravity, particularly if you open up the arachnoid properly. The brain falls back, even though that 1 centimeter, although seems like not too much, but it's a very incredible advantage because it allows you to go as basal as possible. The other advantage, you can just cut the tentorium. The incision, you can see, goes through the whole layer again, goes all the way down to the bone. You need one single burr hole and trying to get as basal as you can. So that allows you to use a drill all the way down to the floor-middle fossa. And you can see in this case, you can use a roger, you can use a drill, and as basal as you can. And now finally you open the dura and arachnoid dissection. If you really don't clean this arachnoid, you don't allow the brain to fall back. So arachnoid dissection is one of the most important steps in all these approaches we're considering. And finally, you can see a beautiful view of the ambient system. You can see the retrocella area, interpeduncular fossa. You can see in this case the basilar tip with the P1, P2. You can see supracerebellar artery, and it's a very nice view of the entire area. Now, if you need a little bit, you can see cutting a little bit of the tentorium to a little bit more proximal exposure. In that case, you need to do a anterior petrosectomy. So that's what we're going to consider very briefly. Anterior petrosa basically expand the subtemporal a little bit more inferior by taking down the petrous apex, so you can go a little bit more inferior, right? So the surgical perspective is the same as the subtemporal. The only thing, I just go and drill the anterior aspect of the petrous bone. And this is a good approach, like lesion like this, for example. Right? This lesion can be very well, if you do this approach properly, can be dealt with the anterior petrosectomy. In this lesion, for example, the tumor is already doing a corridor, making a corridor all the way almost superficial. So a retrosigmoid approach could be still an option, although you can see the lesion is going above the petrous ridge as well. So you can have different options. Some people, they access this one still with a retrosigmoid. If you do properly, if you extend the boundary of this approach properly, you can access this one, for me, a little bit better for anterior petrosectomy, right? That's why I use for the first lesion you can see on the left. And basically, that's the idea. We want to get access to the upper portion of the clivus by taking down the anterior portion of the petrous bone. So basically this one. So but remember, the surgical perspective is this direction. So you have a blind spot on the contralateral upper clivus, but you have a beautiful view of the homolateral upper clivus, mid clivus, and contralateral down portion of the clivus all the way to the hypoglossal canal. That's why learning this anatomy is more than just goes beyond like a book knowledge. this anatomy needs to be really understood possibly on a cadaver, because you really need to understand the anatomy you're negotiating with. I'm not going in details because we don't have time, but understanding the anatomy inside is very, very, it could be complicated. That's why it needs to be done properly. But look at the advantage. For example, this is a typical retrosigmoid perspective. So in order to get to the petroclival region, I need to push laterally the cerebellum. I'm working in a very restricted corridor between the 7-8 cranial nerve. So I can do it, but it's very difficult to get all the way down there. Whereas if I can push, look, for example, this is a translabyrinthine. Translabyrinthine, I can get, maybe you can use even the combined approach. I can have much less need for retraction, but I can get all the way down there. There is a price in this case, because when you do a translab, for example, you lose the hearing. When you do anterior petrosectomy, well done, you don't lose the hearing. But for example, if I have a patient who has already lost the hearing, I definitely use transpetrosal approaches because it allows me a better exposure. So a patient is not hearing is much, for me, is much better than any kind of transpetrosal option. And this is even the best exposure possible with the transcochlear. Transcochlear I use very rarely. It was popularized when skull-based surgery first started many years ago, like more than 30 years ago. But just in case you explore anything else and it's not possible, transposing the facial nerve allows you an incredible exposure all the way down. But again, the price you have to pay is losing the hearing. And if you are not experienced, you've done this not too many times in an unexperienced hand, you can have a facial nerve pulse, or sometimes even paralysis. So it's better not to use this one unless you really explore anything else. There's no other option, right? Confidence with the surgical drill is extremely important. Anytime you're trying to do transpetrosal, whether the ENT surgeon is doing it or you are doing it, you really need to understand what's going on. So the anatomy of the petrous bone is complicated. I highlighted the structure you're going to encounter in any approach: intracranial, carotid, facial nerve, cochlea, ostical chain, labyrinth, sigmoid sinus, jugular bulb. All these structures need to be really understood. Years ago, I was working on models to make sure that people were understanding much better this anatomy. As you can see here in transparency, what's going on underneath the bone. But if I can show you this animation, hopefully it works. This I did while I was at the bar many years ago. And I was trying to understand even different components of the petrous bone, because if you understand the component, you understand how to use a drill and you make everything more faster and more effective. So I really was working a lot to the anatomy of this. Even understanding the relation between the temporal bone surrounding structure, the cavernous sinus, the cerebellopontine angle. This is very important to understand all this. Look, this is a very nice model I built many years ago, in which you can see in transparency all this structure underneath, right? Look, this is like a jewel box. Look how many neurovascular structures are compacted in one single piece of bone. So we really need to understand where everything is, right? That's why my fellows spend a lot of time, not in a day, not in 2 days, but they spend a month just to understand everything. Because at the end, you're using this tiny little corridor, which is anterior to the facial nerve, medial to the carotid, and posterior to the gastric ganglia. So basically, you are working in this tiny little corridor. But in order to get the best benefit, you need to push the dissection to the maximum, avoiding complication. That's why you need to spend time in rehearsing this one. Because otherwise, the opening would be very, very tiny, and you don't get all the benefit, all right? So basically, look at the structure in transparency, and you're going to go work in this so-called quadrangle. Kawase quadrangle is a kind of quadrangle shape, anterior to the facial nerve, medial to the carotid, and you spare the cochlea, which is this location. I don't go too much in detail. I want just show the concept and kind of trigger some interest in you guys just to spend a lot of time, in training about this stuff. And once you open dura, you can see now I have a subtentorial extension of what before was a subtemporal, supratentorial. Now I extend this one infratentorial by open up the petrous apex, basically. So we can see the extension of dura cut goes through the tentorium. I close the superior postural sinus with some surgical clips. You can see the relation with the trochlear nerve. The trigeminal is the boundary between supra and infratentorial, but I have a nice exposure to the cerebellar pontine angle. Now, if I go back to that lesion I showed you before, you might understand why if the opening is so big and I've done a really good job in drilling, I can have a very good exposure for that kind of lesion. I don't need to go from posterior, although it's still possible to do from posterior, but I'm forced in working in a very tiny corridor. I'd rather go from anterior. Now it's giving me more chance to preserve the facial nerve and cause this chance to cause complication. This just to show you the progression. This is a left side. Again, I don't want to go into technicality, but look at this. This is a arcueminence, left side. This is a temporal lobe. This is anteriorly the V3 with the gasteria ganglion. So look at the progression of the dissection. GSPN carotid artery, intrapetus carotid appearing. And now I start drilling the anterior petrosal bone until I find the dura or internal acoustic canal. And I dissect circumferentially until I expose completely the posterior fossa dura. Here you can see the cochlea. So once I open dura, I have now it seems like a very small opening on the posterior fossa. But if I show you, look, this is the internal acoustic canal content. You can see the facial nerve, the superior vestibular, the ICA is looping. And now look, what looks like a very small corridor. That's why it's beautiful doing this animation. If I go around, I have a very nice visualization. So I can see the entire intracanalicular content, the facial nerve again, superior vestibular, the cochlea. I can see the ICA branching off, and I go on the other side. I can see the mid portion of the clivus. I can see the basilar artery. The sixth nerve is crossing the ICA, the dura of the clivus. So I am underneath the B3. So, but in order to be able to achieve this kind of exposure, I need to push dissection to the limit. So that's why I need to spend a lot of time understanding how to do properly, because the exposure is incredible. Because look, the bone is flush with the exposure is flush with the intrapetus carotid. So I have no obstacle all the way down here. If I don't drill the cochlea at the most, sparing the cochlea at the end, but just enough for you to expose properly. Otherwise, so many structure will be in my field, I won't be able to enjoy it. Right? So we have like only a few minutes. I want to mention the posterior prostatectomy as well. What I'm showing are some of the most difficult approaches, because hemispheric approaches, once you master this one, it's going to be pretty easy, because the principle surgical concepts are the same. So I distinguish the posterior prostatectomy, transalbrinting and transcochlear. The difference between the two is that the transalbrinting is going through the labyrinth, transcochlear not only goes through the labyrinth, but basically transpose the facial nerve as well. And there is a way of doing without transposing the facial nerve, because anytime you mobilize the fascia, there's always a potential for complication. So there's a different way of doing it. But the concept is going through the mastoid, going through the labyrinth, and you can see now it's a beautiful view all the way down to the petroclival junction. So that goes very obviously. If I have lost, the patient's already lost the hearing, for me it's a no-brainer. I would definitely use this approach, because the price I have to pay in this is just the hearing, right? But if the patient's already lost, it's definitely no, I would definitely use this one, because I have much better visualization of the area. I don't have to push the cerebellum, and now I have an unobstructed view, basically anterior to the cerebellum. This is a way to see the difference between the approaches: transcochlear, translab, retrolab. You can see retrolab is the least invasive. It doesn't allow you much visualization other than just the lateral segmented portion on the cerebellopontine angle. The translab goes a little bit more anterior, but you still have the 7 and 8 in your surgical route. The transcochlear is the one with the transposition allows the best. But again, we don't use transcochlear only sparingly now, as opposed to before. Positioning is very important, crucial, because you need to make sure that you have the least obstructive view. That's why I like the best. Some people do a complete lateral position. I don't like a complete lateral position, because this shoulder is going to be on my way, because I come from posterior to the lateral to the patient. So I rather having the supine with the shoulder elevated with a pillow, just to rotate a little bit more, but just without angulating too much, because I want, as I mentioned before, I don't want to cause any venous engorgement, and I want to, of course, the airway is clear. Right? So there is a posterior mastoidectomy. I do very quickly this one because now once I take the bone of the mastoid, now I can expose internal acoustic canal from posteriorly. What we saw before in the previous approach, we're looking from the top. Now we go from posterior. So we see the same intracranial component, but basically I see from posterior. So the first two I see is the two vestibular nerves, which I can cut, and I can access the facial nerve anteriorly and superiorly, and the cochlear nerve anteriorly and inferiorly. So the cochlear nerve goes into the cochlea, the facial nerve goes into the tympanic component, joining with the this is the genicular ganglion, and anteriorly is to see the GSPN, and there's the tympanic component on the facial nerve. So everything I see now is from posterior. The limit of this approach is a limitation, of course, is still the 7 and 8 in my surgical field, but the trigeminal nerve is the upper limit, and the lower cranial nerve is the inferior limit. So it's a very beautiful unobstructed view all the way to the cerebellopontine, all the way down to the clivus, but you have some price to pay. But you can see all the intracranial. So again, if the patient is really lost hearing, that's a very good approach. This is a very nice progression on the dissection. As you can see in progression, that's we use this augmented reality, virtual reality a lot. We can see the progression of dissection. And usually we use 3D glasses and 3D, and once you open the dura, you can see entire cerebellopontine. So I don't want to, this you can see in the projection, the superficial projection on this approach is this structure. So I don't want to go any further because I think I'm running out of time. So I won't talk about transcochlear, but I want to use these approaches we've done. Some of these are very complex. Once to trigger your interest and try to make sure that you really want to, nowadays we talk about skull-based, minimal invasive. People are kind of sitting away from some kind of approaches, but I always emphasize people to learn everything, to learn the transcranial, to learn the transsphenoidal, more minimal invasive, and then you really need to decide which one is the best for the patient. And particularly now that you are young, at the beginning of your career, trying to make yourself some time, give some time to spend in the lab. Because once you are in the clinical practice, you are overwhelmed, you don't have time to go back to lab. So now it's time to go back to lab, learn the anatomy during your medical school, but as soon as you have a chance, trying to spend time in refining your skill and understanding the 3D anatomy, surgical anatomy. I stop now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernardo. That was always a tour de force, when you talk about the cranial approaches, and we appreciate it. And we know it could be an entire day of lectures on these topics. So
no, time is limited. That's the problem.
Yes, for sure. Do we have any questions from the attendees? All right, I am not seeing anything. Do you see anything on your end, Kyle?
No, I don't see anything.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bernardo. We'll head into our little lunch break now, and we look forward to having you involved in more programming in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Good luck.
Take care.
Hey everyone, Ryan Rad here from neurosurgerytraining.org. If you like that video, subscribe and donate to keep our content available for medical students across the world.